Night settles over broken stone in places that once seemed unbreakable. Wind moves through the roofless halls of Hattusa. Sand presses against the abandoned outlines of palaces in Mesopotamia. In the eastern Mediterranean cities that traded bronze-grain cedar and ivory go dark, and in some of them the silence lasts so long that their names have to be dug out of the earth thousands of years later. Whole worlds collapse in the ancient past with a kind of finality that still feels unnerving. Walls remain, but the system behind them is gone. Temples stand open to the sky. Archives burn. Roads disappear into dust. The old order, which must once have felt permanent to the people living inside it, turns out to be as fragile as a fired clay tablet dropped on stone. And yet in the middle of this pattern of repeated ancient failure, one civilization keeps reappearing with almost unnatural persistence. Egypt bends, fragments, weakens, changes. Its rulers, loses ground, regains form, and somehow goes on. That is the strange thing waiting beside the Nile. Not that Egypt was eternal. It was not. Not that it never suffered disaster. It did. The evidence remains incomplete in many periods, and scholars still debate exactly how different crises unfolded on the ground. But what survives in the record suggests a civilization that repeatedly does something unusual in history. It outlives shocks that destroy others. Kingdoms rise around it and vanish. Trade networks expand, then snap. Dynasties fail. Foreign armies arrive. Famine visits. Climate shifts. Internal authority splinters. Yet again and again, Egypt returns to itself, or to something close enough that the line of continuity remains visible across astonishing stretches of time. For more than 3,000 years, from the first pharaohs to the last age when temples still function, in the ancient manner Egypt persists in recognizable form. That span is so long that entire civilizations fit inside it and disappear. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The mystery begins with a simple comparison. In the ancient Near East, survival is rarely guaranteed. Sumerian city-states flare and fade in shifting competition. Akkad builds an empire and loses it. Babylon rises more than once, but each version is vulnerable to the same underlying truth. Cities depend on complicated systems, and complicated systems break. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire becomes a serious great power, only to collapse so thoroughly that for centuries it is more ghost than memory. In the Levant kingdoms live under the constant pressure of stronger neighbours and unstable trade. Assyria terrifies the ancient world with military force, then falls with astonishing speed. Persia builds one of the largest empires the world has seen, and even that gives way. The normal story is not endurance. The normal story is brilliance followed by fracture. Egypt should at first glance belong to that same pattern. It is ancient enough, centralized enough, and ambitious enough to suffer the same fate. It builds on flood-dependent agriculture. It relies on elite control labor organization, religious legitimacy, and long-distance exchange. It creates monuments so vast they seem to challenge time itself, which is often exactly what doomed civilizations do, shortly before history reminds them of their scale. Egypt is not a small village culture quietly hidden from the world. It is a state. It is a wealth machine. It is a symbolic order built around kings, temples, storage, taxation, and ritual. These things usually fail dramatically. Sometimes they fail because the climate changes. Sometimes because the ruling class grows brittle. Sometimes because enemies arrive at the wrong moment. Sometimes because the whole structure becomes too expensive to maintain. Often the causes overlap until no single explanation fully accounts for the collapse, and yet Egypt does not simply vanish into one of archaeology's clean endings. Instead, it lingers, reforms, remembers, and continues. Even its collapses are often not true endings, but interruptions, periods when central authority weakens and local powers assert themselves only for a new dynasty to gather the pieces and claim to restore the proper order of the world. That pattern alone sets Egypt apart. Many societies can survive prosperity. Far fewer survive repeated breakdowns without losing their identity entirely. Egypt seems able to endure not because it avoids crisis, but because crisis so often fails to erase the deep framework underneath. To understand why it helps to imagine the Nile Valley before the names of dynasties harden into textbook sequence. A long ribbon of green runs through an otherwise punishing landscape. Beyond it lie deserts that are beautiful in their scale and merciless in their demands. Within the floodplain, however, water arrives, mud settles, crops grow, and people can live with a degree of agricultural predictability rare in the ancient world. This is not a paradise. Too little flood means hunger. Too much can bring destruction. The river is generous, but only within limits. Still, the basic rhythm is there, season after season, year after year. Life concentrates along its edges. Villages become larger communities. Communities become competing centres of power. Power begins to imagine itself in permanent form. Out of that corridor comes one of the earliest territorial states on Earth. Upper and Lower Egypt are joined under a single kingship, at least in political memory, if not always neatly in practice, and something profound happens very early. The state and the landscape begin to reflect one another. The king is not merely a strong man with soldiers, he becomes a necessary point of contact between human order and cosmic order. The river floods, crops rise, temples function, and justice has meaning because the world is being held together correctly. That idea will matter as much as armies matter, perhaps more. A kingdom supported only by fear can be overthrown when fear fails. A kingdom tied to the structure of reality itself is harder to replace, because rebellion then risks becoming more than political. It risks becoming a kind of disorder against the world. This does not mean ancient Egyptians always lived in obedient harmony. They did not. Tomb biographies, administrative texts, and later literary laments hint at corruption, ambition, local rivalry, hunger, and political violence. Ancient Egypt is often imagined now as static, serene, and monumental, but real societies are made of people, and people are restless. The evidence suggests repeated tensions between centre and province throne, and elite ideal and reality. What makes Egypt remarkable is not that it lacked these human pressures. It is that it developed ways of absorbing them without always shattering beyond recovery. Even the monuments tell that story if read carefully. The pyramids are usually treated as symbols of supreme centralized power, and they are that. But they are also signs of a civilization learning how to store labor knowledge and belief across generations. Quarries must be organized, food supplied workers, housed rituals, maintained names, preserved measurements, standardized. Beneath the grandeur is administration. Beneath administration is continuity. A system able to build on that scale is also a system teaching itself how to remember. That capacity for memory may be one of Egypt's least glamorous strengths, and one of its greatest. Other societies build magnificently too, of course, but what survives in Egypt suggests a culture unusually committed to recording, repeating and restoring the forms that make order recognizable. So the question that hangs over the Nile is larger than why a kingdom became rich, or why a dynasty became powerful. Ancient history is full of wealth and power. The deeper question is why Egypt remains legible to itself for so long. Why, when others fall into discontinuity, does Egypt keep finding the old language of authority, the old sacred geography, the old confidence that this land between river and desert has a shape worth rebuilding. Scholars still debate the balance of causes. Geography matters, food supply matters, ideology matters, bureaucracy matters. Luck almost certainly matters more than ancient kings would have liked to admit. But before any single answer appears, the scale of the puzzle has to be felt properly. Stand at the edge of the floodplain in imagination where black fertile soil gives way to red desert, and the whole problem comes into view. On one side lies life concentrated almost unnaturally into a narrow strip of abundance. On the other lies emptiness, distance, and the hard silence of stone. Between them rises one of history's longest experiments in organized survival. Other ancient states blaze and vanish into ruin. Egypt enters ruin more than once, and still returns with its name intact. The shape of Egypt is one of the oldest explanations ever offered for its endurance, and it remains one of the strongest. Before any dynasty writes its name in stone, before the first great royal tombs rise above the desert edge, the land itself has already imposed a strange discipline on human life. Egypt is not a broad open plain like southern Mesopotamia, where cities can multiply across a flat river country and challenge one another from several directions at once. It is not a broken coastline of competing harbours. It is not a loose patchwork of valleys. It is for long stretches a narrow green corridor pressed between inhospitable margins. The Nile Valley compresses life into a ribbon. That compression does not make Egypt invulnerable, but it gives it a coherence many ancient societies never possess. Seen from above, the basic pattern is almost severe in its simplicity. The river runs north through an immense desert frame. Along its banks fields spread where floodwater and silt permit cultivation. Beyond them, usually not very far away, the ground hardens, dries, and begins to empty. In Lower Egypt, the land opens into the delta, where channels divide and wetlands broaden the possibilities for settlement, but even there the river remains the organizing fact. In Upper Egypt, the valley can feel almost claustrophobic in its narrowness, a habitable strip bounded by cliffs and desert plateaus. This is not just scenery, it is political architecture provided by geology. What that means becomes clearer when compared with other early centres of civilization. In Mesopotamia, rivers nourish dense settlement, but the openness of the terrain invites repeated competition and repeated intrusion. Boundaries are difficult to fix. Watercourses shift. Cities rise near one another, each with its own patron god's ambitions and armies. The result is cultural brilliance mixed with chronic instability. Egypt has rival regions too, especially between Upper and Lower Egypt, and the evidence remains incomplete for the exact nature of early struggles. But once political unification takes hold, the land favours long linear control. It is easier to imagine a single authority extending up and down a river corridor than across a broad contested plain filled with equivalent cities. The Nile does not remove conflict, it channels it. The deserts matter just as much as the river. To the west lies the Sahara, immense and forbidding. To the east stretch arid uplands broken by wadis leading toward the Red Sea. Southward, the Nile narrows through cataract country, difficult terrain for transport and invasion. Northward, the delta opens toward the Mediterranean, which is both opportunity and risk. But for much of Egyptian history, the surrounding natural barriers reduce the number of directions from which large threats can easily emerge. This is one reason Egypt often appears protected, though that protection should never be exaggerated. Libya, Nubia, Levantine powers sea peoples, Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, and Romans, all enter Egyptian history in decisive ways. Geography is not a magic wall. Still compared with states exposed on multiple frontiers, Egypt benefits from a defensive setting that slows danger and gives central power more time to respond. There is another advantage hidden inside that same landscape predictability of communication. The Nile is not only a source of fertility, it is a highway running through the state. Boats move grain-stone officials, soldiers, messages, tax goods, and ritual objects along the same basic artery. The prevailing winds often allow movement in one direction by sail, and the river current in the other by drift or rowing, making transport unusually efficient by ancient standards. That matters more than monuments sometimes allow us to remember. A state survives through movement of food to where it is needed, movement of orders from court to province, movement of labour to royal projects, movement of news when trouble begins. Egypt's geography gives administration a physical path to follow. What survives in the record suggests a civilization that learns very early how to use the river, not just to feed itself, but to bind itself. This binding effect reaches into culture as well as government. A people living along the same river under the same annual flood cycle, within the same narrow ecological band, are repeatedly reminded that their world has a visible structure. The fields green and then fade. The water rises and falls. Settlements cluster where the land allows. Sacred places anchor memory at specific points along the valley. The result is a kind of territorial intimacy. Egypt is large, but much of inhabited Egypt is also concentrated and legible. Even when central authority weakens, the civilization's core space remains recognizable to those living inside it. That recognition helps explain why political reunification is often imaginable. The land still looks like one thing even when power does not. Scholars still debate how much this geographical coherence should be allowed to explain. No landscape governs history by itself. Human decisions, social structures, economic networks, ideology, and accident all matter. A favourable environment can still produce failure. There are many examples of ecologically rich regions that never yield durable states, and many durable states that arise in difficult settings. Egypt's geography should therefore be treated as a foundation, not a full answer. It offers opportunities, but those opportunities must be recognized, organized, and defended. The evidence also reminds us that Egypt's environment contains risks of its own. A society concentrated so tightly along one river becomes deeply dependent on that river's behavior. If the flood fails badly enough, the same geographic unity that normally supports the state can spread crisis through the whole country. Even so, the contrast between Egypt and its neighbours remains striking. The deserts that seem empty are not useless margins. They help define the civilization and supply resources from quarries, mines, caravan routes and desert tracks linking the Nile to oases and the Red Sea. They also create symbolic edges. Egyptian art and royal ideology repeatedly present the ordered land of the Nile, in contrast with lands beyond where danger, foreignness and instability begin. That moral geography is not a literal description of reality, but it reflects an enduring mental map. Egypt as a known strip of life, held together against a wider world of uncertainty. A civilization that thinks of itself this way may become more determined to restore order when order slips. The Delta adds a different kind of complexity. It is richer in some ways, more open, more porous, more difficult to control cleanly. Foreign influence often enters there first. Trade thrives there. Armies may approach through routes that bypass the more dramatic desert barriers elsewhere. Yet the Delta is also part of Egypt's resilience, because it expands agricultural wealth and links the country outward to Mediterranean exchange. Egypt is never simply isolated. Its geography combines protection with connection. That balance matters. Total isolation would limit danger, but it would also limit wealth ideas and strategic reach. Egypt instead occupies a position where contact is possible and profitable, but the core heartland remains unusually defensible and internally connected. There is lesser-known detail in all this that makes the map feel even stranger. Ancient Egyptians divide their world not primarily east and west in the modern sense, but through the living logic of the river itself, upstream and downstream, south and north, Upper and Lower Egypt black land and red land. These paired distinctions help structure politics and ritual from the beginning. The king rules the two lands, binding difference into unity. That phrase is not ceremonial fluff. It acknowledges a real duality embedded in the geography, yet insists that successful kingship means holding the duality together. In other words, the land teaches political symbolism at the same time that it shapes practical government. So when later centuries bring invasion, famine, or dynastic collapse, Egypt does not face those pressures as a loose scattering of cities with only temporary alliances between them. It faces them as a civilization already compressed into a memorable form, a river line, a chain of settlements, a sacred corridor bordered by harsh emptiness. The state can fail and will fail more than once, but the stage on which it stands remains powerfully intact. That is one reason Egypt can come apart without fully dissolving. The physical world keeps offering the same basic outline for reconstruction. The endurance of Egypt begins then not with a pharaoh, but with a corridor of habitability so narrow and so commanding that it almost dares politics to become permanent. In many ancient lands, survival requires mastering a difficult environment. In Egypt, survival also means learning how to live inside an environment that constantly suggests unity, concentration, and return. The river flows through the same desert year after year, and the civilization growing beside it begins to absorb that lesson. That lesson becomes material in the flood. Long before Egypt is a kingdom of pyramids and temples, it is a civilization learning to wait for water. Everything depends on a rhythm that arrives from far beyond the visible horizon, from rains deep in the African interior that the people living along the Nile can never fully see, but must trust with their lives. The river begins to swell, then spreads, then withdraws, leaving behind a skin of dark silt that turns a narrow valley into one of the most productive agricultural corridors in the ancient world. It is difficult to overstate what this means for the problem of endurance. Many early societies survive by farming difficult soils under uncertain skies. Egypt survives by organizing itself around a natural cycle that is never perfectly reliable, but is reliable enough, often enough, to create a rare thing, in pre-modern history recurring surplus on a civilizational scale. The annual inundation does not make labor unnecessary. It creates labor. Fields must be measured again after the waters retreat. Basin systems must be maintained. Dikes, canals, and local irrigation works require care, though scholars still debate exactly how centralized water management was in different periods and whether older models overstated direct state control in the earliest eras. What survives in the record suggests a more flexible picture with local communities, regional authorities, and the state all playing roles that shift over time. Still, the broad truth remains clear. The flood turns the valley into an agricultural engine, and agriculture at that scale allows something larger than subsistence. It allows granaries, taxation, specialization, building projects, temple estates, standing administrations, and the ability to survive ordinary bad years by drawing on stored reserves from better ones. This is one of the great hidden advantages behind Egypt's monumental image. Stone monuments capture the imagination, but grain is what makes them possible. A kingdom can raise pyramids only if it can feed large numbers of people beyond the immediate needs of harvest. A court can support priests, scribes, artisans, officials, and transport crews only if food production regularly exceeds bare survival. The Nile flood provides the conditions for that excess. It does not guarantee wise use of it. It does not prevent inequality, abuse, or scarcity in times of stress. But it gives Egyptian rulers something many ancient states crave and seldom sustain. For very long, a recurring material base broad enough to support both political centralization and cultural continuity. The predictability of the river matters as much as its generosity. In Mesopotamia, irrigation supports great cities too, but the environmental pattern is harsher and more volatile in different ways. Rivers can shift violently. Salinization becomes a chronic problem in some regions. Rainfall is less dependable. Egypt's flood, by contrast, creates a seasonal expectation woven into everyday life. The year itself is structured around it. Sowing follows retreating waters. Harvest follows growth. Taxation and state accounting can be tied to an environmental rhythm that most people share directly. That regularity shapes thought. It encourages planning. It gives rulers a visible natural order with which to align their claims. When the king presents himself as guarantor of balance, the flood cycle offers annual proof of how much balance matters. There is a subtle but important point here. Egypt's endurance is not explained only by abundance, but by the relationship between abundance and legibility. A society lasts longer when it can understand where its food comes from, roughly when it will arrive, and how to distribute it across a connected territory. The Nile makes food production unusually legible. Not simple, not foolproof, but legible. Officials can estimate harvests. Grain can be collected and stored. Surplus can be redirected toward military expeditions, temple endowments, famine relief, or elite consumption. The state becomes in part a machine for converting the river's cyclical gift into organized human order. The evidence for this machine survives in humble and revealing ways. Storage facilities, accounting records, scribal exercises, tax notations, and administrative titles all point toward a civilization deeply concerned with measuring, listing, and reallocating resources. Egypt is often remembered through its grandest remains, but its longevity may owe just as much to storerooms and ledgers as to obelisks. Bureaucracy sounds dry beside sacred kingship, yet the two are intertwined. The pharaoh can embody divine order because grain moves, because labor is counted, because local production can be tied upward into royal purpose. Even the afterlife industries of tomb building and funerary cult depend on earthly agricultural predictability. That does not mean the flood is always kind. This is where the smooth image of the Nile must be treated carefully. Egypt's system rests on a gift that can fail. If inundation is too low, fields do not receive enough water, or silt harvests decline and hunger begins to spread. If it is too high, settlements and infrastructure can be damaged. Several of Egypt's most troubled periods appear connected, at least in part, to poor flood levels. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every crisis. But there are moments when climatic stress and weak inundation likely help push existing political problems toward famine and unrest. In other words, the same river that makes Egypt strong also creates a dangerous dependency. A society built around one great environmental rhythm may flourish magnificently, but when that rhythm falters, the consequences are system-wide. And yet even this dependence may strengthen Egypt in the long run because it teaches storage caution and coordination. A kingdom that knows abundance can fail. Any time the water misbehaves has reason to build reserves and ritualize attention to agricultural order. The Nilometer used in later periods to gauge flood levels is one expression of that careful watching. There is something revealing in the very existence of such measurement. Egypt does not simply celebrate the Nile, it monitors it. It translates natural variation into administrative awareness. That habit of watching, recording and responding may be one reason crises sometimes remain survivable instead of terminal. There is also a human consequence to seasonal predictability that matters for political endurance. When farming follows a recurring cycle, there are periods when labour can be redirected. Workers are not necessarily idle, but their time can be mobilised for state projects outside peak agricultural demands. This is one reason large-scale building becomes possible without imagining a population of permanently enslaved pyramid builders in the older popular style. Modern archaeology has shown a more complex picture involving rotating labour provisioning systems, skilled workers, and organised communities. The lesser-known detail here is not merely that Egypt had labour, but that the flood cycle helped free and structure labour in ways the state could harness. Monumentality administration and agricultural timing reinforce each other. The flood also shapes memory and religion. The annual return of fertility is not just useful, it is existentially reassuring. Death and renewal become visible in the land itself. Dry ground is covered then reborn in green. Seeds disappear into mud and rise again. Osiris, kingship, rebirth, and cosmic order all exist within a world where regeneration is not an abstract promise, but a seasonal fact. This does not automatically create political stability, but it does give Egyptian culture a language of return more powerful than that of many societies built under harsher, more chaotic environmental signs. A civilization that sees renewal every year may be more inclined to imagine renewal after crisis. So when historians ask why Egypt lasts so long, they often begin with geography, but geography alone is still too silent. The real foundation is dynamic. It is moving water. It is a calendar of expectation. It is black silt spread over a narrow valley, followed by seed, then harvest, then storage, then redistribution, then the long chain of human arrangements that surplus makes possible. Egypt's monuments rise from stone, but Egypt's longevity rises first from mud. That is why the river's regularity belongs at the centre of the story. It does not remove conflict, ambition, or catastrophe. It does not spare Egypt from collapse. But it gives Egyptian society something rare enough to become historic power, a repeating material certainty strong enough to outlast individual rulers, and often strong enough to help the state rebuild after its own failures. Other ancient civilizations know wealth, but Egypt knows rhythm. And rhythm, when tied to food memory and administration, can become one of the most durable forces in history. Out of that rhythm rises one of the most powerful political ideas ever built in the ancient world, that government is not merely useful but cosmic. Egypt does not endure for so long because it has food alone. Many societies have food. Many river valleys produce surpluses. What Egypt develops with unusual clarity and persistence is a vision in which political authority is fused with the maintenance of reality itself. The king is not simply the strongest man in the land, not simply a war leader, not simply the head of a court. He is the point at which divine order, human society, fertile land temple ritual and justice are meant to meet. If that sounds abstract, it is only because the concept has survived too long in summary. In practice, it affects everything. It shapes how power is obeyed, how crises are interpreted, and how recovery becomes imaginable after collapse. The ancient Egyptian word often brought to the centre of this idea is mat. No single English term captures it. It can mean order, balance, truth, justice, rightness, proper arrangement. It is cosmic and moral at once. The sun rises according to Ma'at. Society functions according to Ma'at. The Nile should flood within a world held in Ma'at. Courts judge in relation to it. kings are expected to uphold it. Disorder, by contrast, is not merely inconvenience. It is a slide towards something dangerous, something close to unmaking. Foreign enemies can be described within this symbolic vocabulary. Rebels can too. Famine, corruption, failed administration, and social inversion all threaten the right arrangement of things. What makes Egyptian kingship durable is that it presents itself not as one political option among others, but as the necessary defense against unraveling. This helps explain why royal imagery remains so consistent for so long. Across dynasties, across major changes in actual political conditions, the king is shown smiting enemies, offering to the gods, receiving life-dominating chaos, guaranteeing continuity. Modern viewers sometimes take this repetition as proof that Egypt is static, even unimaginative. In reality, the repetition is functional. It is a civilizational language of reassurance. Every relief and inscription says in effect that proper order still exists, that the king still stands where he should stand, that temple and cosmos remain aligned. The evidence remains incomplete for how deeply every villager understood elite theological formulations, but what survives in texts, iconography and ritual practice suggests that the bond between rule and sacred order penetrates Egyptian society far beyond palace walls. Kingship is therefore one of Egypt's great survival tools, not because every king is competent, but because the institution carries a kind of excess legitimacy. A weak ruler may fail in practice, yet the office itself remains heavy with meaning. That distinction matters in periods of crisis. In some ancient societies, once the ruler fails, the political centre loses much of its symbolic force. In Egypt, failed rulers can be replaced by new rulers claiming not innovation but restoration. They do not need to invent a fresh political universe. They need to declare that matter has been damaged and must be set right. This makes recovery easier to imagine, easier to narrate, and perhaps easier to accept. Rebellion against a bad king can be framed not as rejection of kingship, but as loyalty to true kingship. The institution survives the man. Religion reinforces this continuity at every level. Temples are not optional decorations to power. They are engines of exchange between gods, ruler land, and people. Offerings are made to sustain divine presence. Rituals are performed with extraordinary regularity. Priests maintain images, purify sacred spaces, speak words that must be spoken in the right sequence. These acts are not mere piety in the background of politics. They are part of how politics works. A kingdom that sees the world as maintained through repeated ritual has an inbuilt bias toward continuity. It must keep doing the right things in the right places if life is to remain secure. That logic can conserve institutions through centuries of change. There is a lesser-known side to this that matters just as much as temple grandeur. The sacred landscape of Egypt is not concentrated in a single holy city. It is distributed along the Nile through cult centers, local gods, regional traditions, necropolises, and ancient sites layered with memory. This distribution allows kingship to operate on multiple scales. The pharaoh is universal ruler of the two lands, but he also participates in a network of local sanctities. That network helps stitch together the country emotionally as well as administratively. A regime is not only collecting taxes, it is placing itself inside an already sacred geography. When later dynasties seek legitimacy, they often restore temples, honor ancient cults, or associate themselves with revered predecessors because sacred continuity is political continuity. The afterlife plays its part too. Egyptian civilization is famously preoccupied with death, but this can be misleading if treated as obsession rather than strategy. Burial remembrance, the preservation of names, tomb cults, and the moral judgment of the dead all reinforce a culture that values permanence and correct procedure. To survive death, one must be prepared properly. To preserve identity, one must be remembered properly. To join the order beyond, one must align with truth and rightness. These habits of mind do not produce political stability automatically, yet they create a civilization unusually invested in the formal maintenance of continuity. A people who think so deeply about preserving the dead are likely to become skilled at preserving institutions too. Of course, ideology has limits. A kingdom cannot pray away drought or talk itself out of administrative breakdown. There are moments in Egyptian history when the sacred image of kingship visibly strains under material disaster. Literary texts from troubled periods speak in tones of inversion and loss. Tomb-building contracts. Local elites become more assertive. Central power weakens. Scholars still debate how literally some of these texts should be read, because elite laments often exaggerate chaos to praise later restoration. But the underlying point remains sound symbolic order cannot survive indefinitely without grain security and functioning government behind it. That is why Egypt's longevity is never the product of ideology alone. Kingship works so well because it rests on geography, agriculture, and administration already discussed. But ideology gives those practical strengths a deeper staying power. It also shapes how foreign rule is absorbed. When outsiders seize Egypt, they often do not abolish Egyptian kingship outright. They imitate it, wear its symbols, build or support temples, and present themselves as rightful pharaohs. This is revealing. It means Egyptian political theology is so entrenched that conquerors find it easier to enter the system than replace it. The Hyksos do this in one way, the Nubian rulers in another, the Ptolemies later, with great sophistication. Even when the rulers are not ethnically Egyptian, the grammar of power remains strongly Egyptian. That kind of institutional magnetism is rare. It suggests a civilization whose sacred political form is durable enough to outlast dynasties, languages of command, and even repeated changes in who sits on the throne. There is also the matter of time. Egyptian kingship quickly becomes ancient even to Egyptians. Each new ruler stands not at a beginning but in a line. Ancestors matter. Founders matter. Great kings of the past are remembered, imitated, selectively reinterpreted. The deeper the tradition becomes, the more authority can be claimed through continuity with it. Time itself becomes a resource of legitimacy. This may be one reason Egypt often appears conservative. Innovation is possible, sometimes substantial, but it is most secure when dressed as renewal. Change advances most smoothly when it can speak in the language of restoration, so the Nile gives Egypt food and shape, but kingship gives it narrative. It tells Egyptians what their state is, for what disorder means, and why rebuilding is holier than surrender. A failed harvest may weaken the centre, a rival prince may seize a province, an invading army may cross a frontier, but the civilization still retains a powerful script for return order has been disturbed. Rightful rule must re-establish it. The gods must be served properly. The two lands must be joined again. No single explanation fully accounts for Egypt's endurance, but without this union of rule and cosmic purpose, that endurance would be far harder to understand. The stone images of pharaohs so motionless to us now once carried that promise in every line. The king stands upright, balanced, facing eternity, while enemies twist beneath him, and gods extend life toward his face. It is not just propaganda. It is the civilization stating what it believes keeps the world from coming apart. Belief can make power meaningful, but belief alone cannot carry grain from the provinces, count cattle, measure fields after the flood, record temple endowments, mobilize quarry expeditions, or remember which village owes what to whom. For that, a civilization needs something less poetic and in some ways even more impressive administrative memory. One of the quiet reasons Egypt lasts so long is that it becomes extraordinarily good at remembering itself in practical form. Beneath the divine king, beneath the monumental stone, beneath the ritual confidence of eternal order, there grows a dense world of scribes, officials, storehouses, tax collectors, overseers, estate managers, couriers, seal bearers, and record keepers. Their labour is not as photogenic as a pyramid, but what survives in the record suggests that Egypt's durability depends on them just as surely as it depends on the Nile. This administrative world emerges early and deepens with time. A territorial state stretched along a river cannot survive on charisma alone. It must know what it possesses. It must identify productive land estimate harvests, collect dues, organize labor provision workers, and maintain links between center and province. Writing becomes essential here not simply as a literary achievement or ceremonial device, but as a tool of continuity. Hieroglyphs are the glamorous face of Egyptian writing carved into stone with divine and royal force, but alongside them develops a more agile written practice for administration, accounting, and daily management. That quieter written culture is one of the foundations of endurance. A society that writes down obligations, deliveries, names, allotments, boundaries, and inventories is harder to erase than one that leaves such matters to memory alone. The importance of the scribe in Egyptian culture reflects this reality. Scribes are often celebrated in wisdom literature and instructional texts as members of an elite profession, and with reason. They stand at the point where knowledge becomes power. To write is to participate in the machinery that binds Egypt together. It is to transform the flood's uncertain abundance into counted grain recorded storage and tax expectation. It is to turn labour into lists into obligations, and obligations into state capacity. The image of the seated scribe, alert and composed, is one of the least dramatic great symbols of Egyptian civilization, yet it may be among the most revealing. Empires often love soldiers and builders. Long-lived states also learn to love accountants. This is where Egypt's apparent traditionalism becomes a strength rather than a weakness. Administrative habits repeated year after year accumulate into institutional reflex. Provinces know the forms expected of them. Officials inherit titles, procedures, and precedents. Temples maintain archives and estates. Royal households operate through offices whose names and responsibilities can persist across dynastic change, even as the individuals filling them rise and fall. Scholars still debate how uniform or centralized these systems are in every period. Egyptian history is long enough that no single administrative model fits all centuries equally well. Some eras are more tightly centralized, others more dependent on regional magnates or temple networks. But the broad pattern is unmistakable. Egypt becomes a civilization that records enough of itself to be governable across generations. Storage is just as important as writing. Granaries are not glamorous, yet they sit at the heart of Egypt's survival strategy. Agricultural surplus only becomes state power if it can be collected, preserved, and redistributed. That means buildings, labour arrangements, transport systems, seals, inspections, and a whole moral and coercive order surrounding delivery and withholding. Famine, relief court, consumption, temple offerings, military campaigns, and public works all depend on grain moving through controlled channels. A bad harvest can still produce suffering, corruption, and unrest, but a state with storage has options. A purely local subsistence economy does not. This matters especially in a civilization repeatedly exposed to fluctuations in flood levels. Storage turns good years into protection against bad ones, at least in theory. When it fails, the failure is often political rather than environmental alone. The tax system reveals the same logic. Taxes in ancient Egypt are not just burdens imposed by rulers. They are one of the ways the state converts scattered productivity into collective endurance. Grain livestock labour, manufactured goods and other dues pass upward through administrative layers that can feel oppressive to those inside them, and no doubt often were. Yet without such extraction, there is no large-scale resilience, no ability to maintain temples, armies, officials, and emergency reserves. The state survives by drawing resources out of local communities and then returning them in the form of order protection, ritual legitimacy, and redistribution. When the bargain works, Egypt is unusually stable. When it stops working, local elites begin to behave more like independent powers, and the old unity starts to thin. This is why bureaucracy and kingship belong together. The pharaoh may symbolize Maat, but bureaucracy operationalizes it. Order must be written, counted, and sealed. A royal decree means little unless it can travel. A temple foundation means little unless its holdings are surveyed and protected. A monumental building project means little unless food reaches the workers and tools reach the site. Even the dead depend on administration. Tomb cults require endowments. Priests require rations. Mortuary estates require management. Eternity in Egypt often turns out to have paperwork behind it. There is a surprising humanity in that realization. It brings ancient Egypt closer. Behind the serene ideal of perfect continuity stands a civilization full of queues, inspections, deliveries, shortages, corrections, disputes, and scribbled notations. Ostraca and papyri preserve glimpses of this world with startling immediacy. A worker misses duty, a shipment is delayed, a complaint is lodged, a ration is counted, a boundary is marked. These fragments remind us that Egypt's long life is not maintained by abstract principles alone, but by thousands upon thousands of ordinary administrative acts repeated over centuries. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the daily experience of lower status people, but what survives suggests a state whose endurance is built not only from top-down command, but from endlessly renewed habits of organization. One lesser-known detail sharpens the point. Egypt's ability to rebuild after crisis may owe much to the fact that its institutions are often embedded in places and offices rather than in a single fragile center. If a dynasty collapses, local administrators, temple authorities, provincial elites, and scribal traditions do not necessarily disappear with it. They can become the scaffolding from which reunification later grows. This can be dangerous because strong local powers may also accelerate fragmentation. But it also means collapse is rarely absolute. The country does not fall into pure blankness. Too much knowledge of how to govern still exists. Too many offices still function in reduced form. Too many people still know how Egypt is supposed to work. That memory can become almost archaeological within Egyptian history itself. Later rulers restore old monuments, copy older inscriptions, revive archaic styles, or present themselves as heirs to long-dead kings. This is often discussed as ideology, and it is ideology, but it is also administrative conservatism made visible. The past is not admired from a distance, it is used. Old formulas still have force, old landholding patterns may still matter, old temple rites may still shape new politics, time layers rather than erasers. A civilization capable of using its own past as working material is better equipped to survive than one forced to improvise from scratch after every disruption. Of course, bureaucracy can also become heavy, corrupt, and self-protective. Temple wealth can grow so large that it competes with royal authority. Offices can become hereditary. Local notables can exploit the state's demands for personal gain. The machine that preserves continuity can also trap the kingdom in rigid habits. No single explanation fully accounts for Egypt's endurance, and it would be misleading to treat administration as a perfect instrument. It is often messy, unequal, and vulnerable to abuse. But durability does not require perfection. It requires repeatable function. Egypt has that in unusual measure, so by the time the great ages of royal splendor unfold, the deeper miracle is already in place. The Nile provides the harvest. Kingship provides the sacred script. Bureaucracy provides recall. It allows Egypt to know what it has to move, what it gathers, to preserve what it values, and to resume what has been interrupted. Other ancient powers build quickly and brilliantly, but when crisis comes, too much of their operating memory disappears with the regime. Egypt, by contrast, learns how to store memory in offices, texts, granaries, institutions, and habits of rule. A civilization that can remember itself this thoroughly is much harder to kill, and yet Egypt does crack. For all the weight of its kingship, for all the grain stored against uncertainty, for all the rituals of order and the scribal habits of continuity, there comes a moment when the old confidence thins and the centre no longer holds with the same force. This is what makes Egypt's long life so interesting. If it had simply remained stable from beginning to end, it would be impressive but easier to explain away, as a lucky river civilization protected by geography. Instead, Egypt enters periods of real fracture. Authority fragments, provinces assert themselves, royal power weakens, the language of cosmic order remains, but reality on the ground grows harder to fit into it. The first great example of this is the period later called the First Intermediate Period, and it matters because here, perhaps for the first time on a national scale, Egypt shows what happens when its system stops feeling inevitable. The collapse of the Old Kingdom is not a single event with a neat date and one obvious cause. Scholars still debate the balance between political exhaustion, economic strain, elite competition, environmental stress, and the changing relationship between the crown and provincial authorities. The evidence remains incomplete, and older textbook stories of sudden total ruin have been revised by more careful archaeological work. What survives in the record suggests not instant annihilation, but a thinning of central capacity over time. Royal building had been vast. Courtly institutions had accumulated prestige and demands. Powerful officials in the provinces, the nomarchs, had gained wealth and local standing. Mortuary cults and elite endowments tied resources into long chains of maintenance. The crown remained symbolically immense, yet the mechanisms that once concentrated power so effectively may have become harder to sustain. Then, environmental trouble seems to enter the picture. Around the end of the Old Kingdom, low Nile floods may have contributed to serious food shortages. There is wider paleoclimatic evidence for episodes of aridity affecting parts of the region, and many historians see climate stress as one important factor in the troubles that follow. But caution is needed here. Climate is rarely destiny by itself. Many societies endure poor years without collapsing, while others collapse when political systems are already brittle. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened in Egypt. Weak floods may have exposed underlying vulnerabilities rather than causing them alone. A state that depends so thoroughly on the Nile can survive fluctuation for a time, but if low inundation coincides with weakened central authority, local hoarding, administrative failure, and rising competition between elites, then scarcity becomes something more dangerous than hunger. It becomes political disintegration. The image left by later Egyptian texts is dramatic. Some compositions describe a world turned upside down, where the poor possess goods and the wealthy are brought low, where tombs are violated, norms inverted, authority mocked, and suffering spreads across the land. These texts are among the most haunting documents in ancient literature, but they must be handled carefully. Many are literary works shaped by hindsight, moral agenda, or rhetorical exaggeration. They may not be straightforward eyewitness reports. Even so, they tell us something important. Later Egyptians remembered this period as a rupture in order itself. Whether every detail reflects literal conditions is less important than the underlying truth. The kingdom had entered a phase when unity could no longer be assumed. In practical terms, power shifts outward. Instead of one overwhelmingly dominant royal centre directing the life of the two lands' regional elites, gain room to manoeuvre. Provinces do not simply wait helplessly for orders from a fading court. They build their own networks, sponsor their own monuments, cultivate their own local reputations, and in some cases present themselves as protectors of their people. This is one of the surprising features of the first intermediate period. It is not only a time of decline, it is also a time when local initiative becomes more visible. Tomb inscriptions from provincial officials sometimes emphasize how they fed the hungry, maintained stability, and acted justly in difficult conditions. These claims are of course self-serving. Elite inscriptions usually are. But what survives in the record suggests that the weakening of the centre allows regional society to become more politically assertive and more narratively self-aware. That matters because it complicates the idea of collapse. From the viewpoint of a centralized monarchy, this period is a disaster. From the viewpoint of a provincial elite family, it may be a moment of opportunity. Egypt does not empty out. Its villages do not vanish overnight. Its sacred geography remains. Agriculture continues, though unevenly and under stress. Temples endure in reduced or transformed ways. Writing continues. Burial continues. Local government continues. What fails is not civilization itself, but the ability of one court to dominate the whole country with the confidence of the Pyramid Age. This distinction is crucial. Egypt's first major breakdown is severe enough to expose its fragility, but not so severe that it erases the tools needed for future reunification. The symbolic damage, however, is real. The Old Kingdom had projected enormous authority through pyramid complexes, royal mortuary religion, and the visual certainty of centralized kingship. Once that order weakens, the contrast is painful. The king is still king in theory, but theory now competes with lived fragmentation. Rival centres claim legitimacy. Northern and southern powers circle each other uneasily. The old image of perfect unity becomes aspirational rather than descriptive. In a civilization built on the principle that rule sustains cosmic order, this is more than administrative inconvenience. It is a wound in the meaning of kingship. And yet even here something distinctively Egyptian appears. The language used to describe good rule does not disappear. The desire for reunification does not disappear. The ideal of the two lands under one rightful authority remains alive even while the reality is broken apart. That persistence is one reason this crisis becomes a proving ground rather than a terminal fall. Egypt's political centre may weaken, but Egypt's civilizational imagination stays remarkably intact. People still know what a proper kingdom is supposed to look like. They still know the forms of justice, provision, piety, and legitimacy expected from rulers. They still inhabit the same river corridor, depend on the same flood, and bury their dead within the same moral horizon. Collapse interrupts the machine, but it does not erase the blueprint. There is a lesser-known irony in this period as well. Some of the cultural diversification that emerges during fragmentation may actually strengthen Egypt later. Local artistic styles become more visible. Provincial elites leave richer records of their self-presentation. New forms of literary reflection on suffering kingship and order begin to circulate. When the kingdom eventually reassembles, it does so not as a simple replay of the old kingdom, but as a state that has learned something from failure. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that crisis forces Egypt to become more aware of its own internal complexity. So the first intermediate period deserves to be seen clearly. It is not a footnote between brighter dynasties. It is the moment when Egypt first demonstrates that it is vulnerable to the same kind of unravelling that destroys other ancient powers. Harvest uncertainty, elite ambition, weakened central control, symbolic strain and regional competition all gather into a genuine fracture. The old world of pyramid certainty is over. A civilization that once seemed to move in one direction now breaks into pieces. But those pieces are still Egyptian. The river still runs through them. The old language of order still clings to them. The scribes still write. The tombs still fill. The gods are still served, even if unevenly. The memory of unity remains sharper than the reality of division. And that may be the most important thing of all. Egypt has now shown that it can fail. The next question is whether it can do something rarer, fail, and then find its way back. What follows is one of the clearest reasons Egypt cannot be explained as a civilization that merely got lucky once and then coasted on its geography. After the first great fracture, it comes back together. Not instantly, not cleanly, and not because suffering somehow purifies a society into wisdom. Reunification is political, military, symbolic and practical all at once. It requires ambition from particular rulers, pressure against rivals, and enough support from elites and institutions to make unity desirable again. But the deeper point is that reunification is thinkable. Egypt does not stare at its own fragmentation and invent a new political future built from unrelated pieces. Instead, it reaches back toward an older pattern of order and tries to restore it. That act of return is one of the great secrets of Egyptian endurance. The process centers on Thebes in Upper Egypt, a city that rises from regional strength into national destiny. During the first intermediate period, Egypt is divided among competing power centers, with Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south, becoming the major poles of rivalry. This is not simply a contest between two towns. It is a struggle over who gets to define legitimate kingship after the old kingdom order has failed. What survives in the record suggests that Theban rulers become increasingly successful at presenting themselves not merely as local strongmen, but as restorers of the two lands. That distinction matters. Conquest alone might create another short-lived regime. Restoration carries the moral gravity of renewal. It allows force to be wrapped inside civilizational memory. The eventual victory of Mentuhotep II, who reunifies Egypt at the start of the Middle Kingdom tradition, is often treated as a turning point in dynastic sequence, but it deserves to be felt as something larger. Egypt has tested its own fragility and survived the test without forgetting its shape. A ruler can still claim to gather north and south back into one body. The ancient idea of kingship, though bruised, still has authority enough to mobilize armies, rituals, and loyalties behind that project. Scholars still debate the exact tempo of reunification and the degree to which conflict was sustained or episodic in different regions, but no single explanation is needed to see the broader pattern. The old center may have failed, yet the old ideal of unity remained stronger than centrifugal habits. Part of the reason lies in the very thing that made the crisis survivable in the first place. Fragmentation did not destroy the operating culture of Egypt. Provincial elites gained autonomy, but they remained embedded in Egyptian forms of legitimacy. They still commissioned tombs in recognizable styles. They still spoke the language of moral rule, right provision and proper burial. They still lived within the sacred geography of the Nile Valley. In other words, local power expanded without becoming fully alien to the civilization it had partly replaced. That matters enormously. When reunification comes, it is not the conquest of foreigners over strangers. It is a reassembly of parts that, for all their rivalry, still understand themselves through related symbols, institutions, and expectations. This is where Egyptian ideology proves its resilience. Ma'at has not vanished just because the kingdom has fractured. On the contrary, fragmentation makes the ideal sharper. Disorder can now be pointed to as a lived reality rather than a theoretical danger. Reunification therefore becomes morally legible. It is not merely advantageous, it is right. A successful ruler is not presented as inventing a new state from his own genius, but as defeating chaos, feeding the land, restoring temples, rebalancing what has gone wrong. This language may sound formulaic, yet it is precisely the formula that gives Egypt such durability. States that can only justify themselves through novelty are often brittle. Egypt repeatedly justifies power through restoration, which is more flexible and often more persuasive. There is also a practical logic behind reunification that should not be underestimated. The Nile corridor still encourages integration. Grain still moves more effectively through a unified system than through competing regional ones. Military security improves when one court can mobilize resources along the length of the valley. Long-distance exchange taxation, major building and the management of flood-dependent agriculture all work more efficiently when the country is not split between rival kings. Even ambitious local elites may find advantages in joining a restored order, so long as they are given honored places within it. This is one reason successful reunification in Egypt often looks less like total annihilation of provincial power and more like its incorporation into a newly energized center. The Middle Kingdom that emerges from this recovery is in many ways a more mature state than the one that fell. That does not mean it is kinder or less hierarchical. It means it seems to have learned from breakdown. Royal authority is rebuilt, but with closer attention to administration, provincial management, and the articulation of justice. Kingship remains sacred, yet texts from the period often show a heightened concern with the burdens of rule, the dangers of internal threat, and the need for effective governance. The literature associated with the early Middle Kingdom, including instruction texts and tales shaped by the memory of instability, suggests a civilization thinking more consciously about how order is kept. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives hints that collapse has produced not only fear but political introspection. One lesser-known detail captures this change beautifully. The royal mortuary architecture of the Middle Kingdom does not simply try to outdo the Great Pyramids of the Old Kingdom in scale. The emphasis shifts. There is still monumental construction, but the regime seems less focused on the overwhelming singularity of pyramid grandeur and more on a broader architecture of control, defense, and administration. This is not a decline in ambition. It is a change in strategy. Egypt no longer needs only to display timeless power. It needs to make power work after having seen what happens when it fails. The relationship between king and province also becomes more carefully managed. Provincial elites who had grown strong during the first intermediate period cannot simply be wished away. They must be balanced, supervised, absorbed, sometimes curtailed. The crown responds through appointments, restructuring, and efforts to keep local power from becoming permanently separatist again. Scholars still debate how systematic these reforms are and how evenly they are applied, but the trend is clear enough. Reunified Egypt tries to preserve the advantages of centralized order without completely ignoring the realities exposed by fragmentation. In that sense, it becomes a civilization not only of tradition, but of adaptive tradition. This ability to adapt without abandoning identity may be the deepest answer yet to the question of why Egypt lasts so long. Many ancient states can centralize, many can conquer, fewer can recover from internal collapse by changing just enough to survive while still feeling like themselves. Too much rigidity breaks under pressure. Too much change dissolves continuity. Egypt at its best moments finds a middle path. It absorbs lessons from disaster and translates them into renewed forms of old legitimacy. Reunification also restores confidence in time. Once the country is whole again, the past can be claimed rather than mourned. Old kings are remembered as precedents, old monuments as inheritances, old sacred sites as living anchors rather than ruins of a vanished people. This matters emotionally as much as politically. A civilization is stronger when it can see its own past as usable rather than lost. Egypt repeatedly performs that act of reclamation. It is always in some sense repossessing itself. So the period after the first fracture is not just a recovery, it is a demonstration. Egypt has now shown that its identity runs deeper than any single dynasty, deeper even than one form of kingship. The river corridor remains coherent, the moral language of order remains available, provincial society remains culturally Egyptian, and ambitious rulers can still make a convincing case that the land should be one. That is why the return matters so much. It reveals that Egypt's endurance lies not in avoiding failure, but in making failure reversible. Where other ancient worlds break and disappear into discontinuity, Egypt discovers a harder talent. It can remember unity while living through division. And because it can remember it can build it again. Once Egypt has proved that it can fall apart and then return, a new kind of strength becomes possible. Endurance is no longer just a gift of geography or the inherited momentum of an early state. It becomes experience. The civilization knows now that order can be lost and rebuilt. That knowledge sits beneath the surface of the Middle Kingdom and reaches its fullest expression in the New Kingdom, when Egypt steps beyond the narrow question of simple survival and begins to behave more openly like an empire. This is another test that destroys many states. Expansion brings wealth, but it also brings strain. Victory creates prestige, but it also creates enemies, overextension, and dependence on foreign tribute trade routes and military force. Empires often lose themselves in the act of becoming large. Egypt does something more unusual. For long stretches it expands without entirely surrendering the inner logic that had made it durable in the first place. The Middle Kingdom already shows signs of this outward confidence. Fortresses rise in Nubia. State attention reaches more aggressively toward frontiers. Mining expeditions and quarrying operations are organized with impressive regularity. Trade and diplomatic contacts extend into the Levant toward Punt and deeper into African and Eastern networks. This is not yet empire in the later New Kingdom sense, but it is a civilization growing more deliberately strategic. What survives in the record suggests a state capable not only of administering the Nile Valley, but of imagining the spaces beyond it as zones to be managed, secured, or exploited. That shift matters because it reveals a deeper reserve of political capacity. Egypt is not simply surviving behind its deserts. It is learning how to project power past them. Then comes another rupture, the Hyksos period, and with it another lesson. Foreign rulers establish themselves in the delta. Egypt is not erased, but its vulnerability is exposed in a new way. The old protective geography is not enough. Military technologies and political structures from the broader Near Eastern world press more deeply into Egyptian experience. Yet here again the long-term result is not disappearance, but adaptation. When native Egyptian rulers based in Thebes eventually expel the Hyksos and reunify the country, they do not merely restore what existed before. They transform Egypt into something more militarized, more outward-looking and more conscious of the dangers posed by neighboring powers. In a sense, foreign rule teaches Egypt how to avoid being ruled the same way again. The new kingdom rises from that hard education. Under rulers such as Ahmose Thutmose III, Hatshepsut Amenhotep III, and others, Egypt reaches a scale of wealth and influence unmatched in its earlier history. Campaigns push into Syria-Palestine. Nubia is drawn more tightly into imperial control. Tribute trade goods, captives, prestige objects, raw materials and diplomatic marriages connect Egypt to a wider system of great powers. Temples grow vast on the profits of conquest and exchange. Royal building becomes expansive again, but now on a scale linked to empire as much as to internal administration. The Nile remains the heart, yet the state now beats in relation to lands far beyond it. This would seem at first glance like the beginning of the end. Empires tend to spend the capital of older stability very quickly. The need to defend distant frontiers can drag the center into permanent mobilization. Wealth from conquest can inflate temples and elites into rival power centers. Foreign influence can unsettle older identities. And in Egypt some of this does happen. The new kingdom is not a simple triumph. It contains its own long-term risks. Yet for centuries Egypt manages an impressive balance. It takes in the wealth of empire while preserving a strong sense that Egypt itself remains distinct, sacred, and central. Foreign lands are taxed, raided, negotiated with, dominated, or feared, but they are rarely allowed to define the soul of the civilization. Egypt treats empire as an extension of kingship, not a replacement for Egyptian identity. That distinction appears everywhere in royal presentation. Kings campaign abroad, but they do so as pharaohs maintaining Mahat. Victories in Asia or Nubia are framed not as adventurous expansion for its own sake, but as the suppression of disorder beyond Egypt's borders. The empire is therefore symbolically absorbed into the older civilizational script. Foreign tribute confirms the king's power. Captives and exotic goods appear in temple reliefs as signs that the ordered center has mastered the unstable margins. This may sound like mere ideology, but ideology is one of the ways states prevent new realities from dissolving old coherence. Egypt's imperial age lasts as long as it does partly because it narrates expansion in familiar terms. The temple system becomes crucial here. Conquest enriches major sanctuaries, especially Amun's cult at Thebes. Temples accumulate land-labor treasure and influence on a scale that can rival the crown's own immediate reach. This is one of the paradoxes of Egypt's success. The very institutions that preserve continuity can grow so wealthy that they threaten central balance. During the height of the new kingdom, however, the relationship often remains mutually reinforcing. Military victories glorify the gods legitimize kingship. Kingship funds temples. Temples anchor the moral and ritual order of the state. The whole system appears magnificently self-confirming. Scholars still debate how stable this balance really is beneath the monumental record. But what survives suggests that for a long time, Egypt can convert imperial wealth into internal grandeur without immediately breaking apart. There is also an administrative side to this imperial durability. Empire requires paperwork as much as war. Garrisons must be supplied, governors, vassals, and tributary arrangements must be monitored. Diplomacy must be conducted across languages and political cultures. The Amarna letters from a later part of the New Kingdom give a remarkable glimpse of this world. Rulers and local princes writing in Akkadian, across a network of correspondence that binds Egypt into the great power politics of the late Bronze Age. The lesser-known lesson in these archives is not just that Egypt is important abroad, but that it is institutionally capable of participating in a complex international system without ceasing to be itself. This is not the behavior of a fragile river kingdom clinging to isolation. It is the behavior of a civilization confident enough to engage outward while resting on deep internal habits of continuity. Still, the strain is real. Armies become more central. Frontier security becomes a permanent concern. Court politics grow more dangerous as wealth intensifies competition. Foreign campaigns can succeed spectacularly, but they also create obligations that do not end when a victorious inscription is carved. The farther power extends, the more maintenance it requires. No single explanation fully accounts for how Egypt avoids immediate imperial overreach, but several factors help. The Nile core remains rich and coherent. Administrative memory remains strong. Kingship still carries immense symbolic force, and unlike some empires built on a loose federation of very different heartlands, Egypt's core identity is unusually concentrated in one connected river society. Empire adds to Egypt. It does not instantly dilute it. That concentrated identity may be the most important point of all. Conquest changes Egypt, certainly. Foreign captives, goods, artistic influences, military technologies, and diplomatic habits all enter the civilization in more visible ways. Yet the center still imagines itself as the center. The Nile still defines the sacred heartland. The temples still localize divine order in Egyptian places. The king still rules the two lands first, even when he also dominates territories beyond them. This prevents expansion from becoming complete dispersion. Egypt can be imperial without forgetting where Egypt is. There is a deeper irony here. Many civilizations disappear because they are too weak to resist the wider world. Others disappear because they become too entangled in the wider world to preserve their internal balance. Egypt survives so long in part because it learns for a time how to do both things at once, open itself enough to become rich and formidable, but not so completely that the river kingdom loses its sense of sacred administrative and cultural center. That balance will not last forever. It never does, but for centuries it holds with remarkable force. So the Age of Empire does not interrupt the old story of endurance, it enlarges it. Egypt proves that it can survive not only as a stable agricultural kingdom, but as a major power moving through conquest diplomacy and foreign complexity without immediately dissolving into the fate of other ancient empires. It remains Egypt while becoming something bigger, and that may be one of the rarest achievements in ancient history. But expansion does not end the old danger. It only changes its shape. A civilization can be strongest at the very moment it begins to absorb forces that will trouble it for centuries afterward. Egypt's imperial age creates wealth, prestige, and military reach, but it also opens the country more fully to the realities of foreign rule, foreign technology, foreign diplomacy, and foreign ambition. The old image of the Nile world as naturally protected is now harder to maintain without qualification. Egypt can still dominate its neighbors, but it can also be entered by them, influenced by them, and eventually ruled by them. What matters, though, is what happens next. Again and again, outsiders take power in Egypt, and again Egypt proves unexpectedly difficult to erase. The Hyksos have already shown the first version of this pattern. Their rule in the Delta is not a simple barbarian interruption in a pure native story, as older nationalist histories once preferred to imagine. The evidence suggests something more complicated: foreign origin elites establishing authority within existing Egyptian frameworks, using local institutions while also introducing military and political changes shaped by wider Near Eastern connections. They are outsiders, yes, but not outsiders standing wholly outside Egypt. They govern in Egyptian space among Egyptian populations, and to some degree through Egyptian forms. That is the revealing part. Egypt's system is robust enough that even foreign rulers often find it easier to inhabit than to dismantle. The same logic returns later in more dramatic form. Nubian kings from Kush will one day take Egypt and present themselves not as destroyers of pharaonic tradition, but as its restorers. Persian conquerors will rule as pharaohs in official terms, however uneasy the fit may sometimes be. Alexander the Great will take Egypt and the dynasty that follows him. The Ptolemies will become masters of one of the most sophisticated acts of cultural political adaptation in ancient history. Greek rulers governing Egypt by speaking in public and temple life the language of pharaonic kingship. This is not cosmetic. It reveals something deep. Egypt's sacred political order has become so authoritative that conquerors repeatedly seek legitimacy through it rather than against it. There is a reason for this beyond convenience. Egypt is not merely territory. It is a civilizational script. To rule Egypt effectively, one must engage with the temples, the priesthoods, the sacred geography, the flood cycle, and the expectation that proper kingship sustains cosmic balance. A conqueror who ignores these things risks ruling only superficially. A conqueror who adopts them can plug into a much older reservoir of legitimacy. This makes Egypt unusually persistent under foreign domination. The ethnic or dynastic identity of the ruler may change, but the visible structure of rulership can remain recognizably Egyptian. In practical terms, that continuity helps everyday administrative and agricultural life continue. In symbolic terms, it blurs the line between conquest and succession. That does not mean foreign rule is harmless or universally accepted. Far from it. Egyptian history preserves repeated resentment toward outsiders, repeated rebellions, and repeated efforts by native rulers to cast themselves as liberators. Foreign domination can extract wealth, disrupt older balances, and reshape elite life in lasting ways. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases, especially for how ordinary villagers in different periods experienced these shifts. But what survives suggests a recurring tension. Egypt can absorb foreign rulers into its political form, yet it never entirely stops measuring them against Egyptian ideals. A dynasty may survive longer if it becomes legible as pharaonic. It remains vulnerable if it seems merely exploitative or impious. Military change is part of this story as well. Egypt learns from foreign threats. The shock of the Hyksos contributes to the militarization of the new kingdom. Later pressures from Libyan sea peoples, Assyrians, Persians, and others force Egyptian rulers to think beyond the older assumption that deserts and river corridors alone will shield the state. Chariots, composite bows, fortified frontiers, mercenary service, and international diplomacy all become more prominent, because the ancient world around Egypt is changing. This is another reason Egypt lasts so long. It is not frozen in the age of the pyramids. It can borrow, adapt, and deploy outside methods when survival demands it. Yet adaptation has a cost. Every new military dependency, every imported technique, every foreign mercenary group settled in or near the Nile, every diplomatic entanglement with the Near East increases the complexity of the kingdom. Complexity is useful, but it is never neutral. States can become dependent on the very tools they adopt to survive. A kingdom that increasingly relies on foreign soldiers, foreign horses, foreign metals, or foreign trade routes becomes harder to separate from the wider world's disruptions. Scholars still debate the extent to which such entanglements directly weaken Egypt in different periods, but no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. What seems clear is that Egypt's openness to adaptation keeps it alive in the short and medium term, even while making its old insulated stability less and less recoverable. There is a lesser-known cultural consequence too. Foreign rule often intensifies Egyptian traditionalism rather than dissolving it. When outsiders occupy the throne temples, priesthoods, and local elites may become even more invested in preserving language ritual and sacred memory. Cultural endurance can sharpen under political pressure. This is one reason Nubian rule, for example, can appear in some respects more traditionally Egyptian than some native Egyptian dynasties before it. The Kushite kings admire older forms, revive archaic styles, and align themselves closely with established religious legitimacy. Foreignness, paradoxically, can become a vehicle for restoration. Egypt's civilizational gravity is strong enough to pull conquerors backward into its past. The Assyrian invasions reveal the harsher side of the same pattern. When Assyria, one of the ancient world's most formidable military empires, strikes Egypt, the violence is real, and the imbalance of power unmistakable. Cities are threatened, rulers displaced, the old aura of inviolability shattered. But even Assyrian victory does not permanently dissolve Egypt into a meaningless province. Native dynasts return. Egyptian forms persist. The country remains a prize precisely because it is still rich, structured, and symbolically powerful. Conquest here is never mere devastation. It is a battle over possession of one of the ancient world's oldest and most prestigious states. By the time Persian rule arrives, the pattern is unmistakable. Egypt can be conquered, yet conquest is not the same as civilizational death. The land still has to be governed through its fields, temples, and administrative logic. The Nile still floods. The old cult centers still matter. Rebellions still frame themselves in native terms. Even resistance shows continuity. Egypt may no longer be able to keep every outsider at bay, but it remains hard to digest. It preserves enough density of identity that domination does not immediately turn into disappearance. That is why foreign rule should not be treated merely as evidence of decline. It is evidence of exposure, certainly, and of changing geopolitical realities Egypt cannot always master. But it is also one of the best proofs of Egypt's durability. A fragile civilization often shatters when conquered. A deeply rooted one may survive conquest by forcing conquerors to participate in its existing structures. Egypt repeatedly does the latter. Its language of kingship, temple order, sacred geography, and agrarian administration proves more enduring than many of the dynasties that claim it. Still, the cost accumulates. Every occupation leaves traces. Every adaptation changes the kingdom a little. Every restored ruler returns to a world somewhat less self-contained than before. Egypt's strength is no longer the untouched continuity of early ages, if it ever truly was. It is now the tougher continuity of a civilization learning how to remain itself under the pressure of others. That is a harder achievement, but also a more tiring one. Endurance under foreign rule is not the same as freedom. It keeps the civilization alive, yet it also teaches that survival and sovereignty are no longer identical. So the shock of foreign rule does not answer the question of why Egypt lasted so long by proving the old protections failed. It answers it by showing that when those protections failed, something deeper still remained. Conquerors could seize Egypt, tax it, reshape it, and sit upon its throne. What they struggled to do was make it stop being Egypt. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the wider ancient world begins to look like a field of broken lights. Great powers that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for centuries start to dim almost at once. Palaces burn, trade routes fail, archives end abruptly, cities are abandoned or reduced. The Hittite Empire disappears as a serious imperial force. Mycenaean palace centres collapse. Ugarit once plugged deeply into maritime trade, and diplomatic exchange sends out desperate messages before going silent. In parts of the Levant and beyond, old systems unravel so completely that later generations inherit not stable kingdoms, but fragments, memories, and ruins. This is one of history's most famous episodes of interconnected collapse, and Egypt stands inside it, not outside it. That matters. Egypt does not survive because it escapes the storm altogether. It survives because while damaged and strained, it does not fall in the same way. The Late Bronze Age world is deeply interconnected. Tin copper luxury goods, weapons, grain, timber horses, diplomatic gifts, marriage alliances and specialized crafts circulate across a broad zone, stretching from the Aegean to Mesopotamia and Egypt. Kings write to one another as peers. Courts expect regular contact. Armies depend on materials from far away. Prestige economies grow increasingly entangled with long-distance exchange. This creates extraordinary wealth and sophistication, but it also creates systemic vulnerability. When enough links begin to fail at once, disruption spreads faster than more local systems might have allowed. Scholars still debate the exact causes of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Invasion, rebellion, climate stress, famine, internal instability, earthquakes, disrupted trade, and cascading political failure all appear in different combinations. No single explanation fully accounts for the whole pattern. What matters for Egypt is that it faces many of the same pressures and still remains standing. One reason is scale of internal support. Some Late Bronze Age states are heavily palace-centered in ways that make them especially brittle. When the palace economy fails, too much of the state's redistributive logic fails with it. Egypt has palaces, of course, and courts of immense importance, but it also has something more deeply embedded, a river-based agricultural core that continues to generate life even when imperial structures are under strain. The Nile Valley is not immune to broader economic shocks, yet its basic food production does not depend to the same extent on the same kinds of international logistical webs as some more exposed systems. Egypt can lose influence abroad, face raids, and suffer political crisis without instantly losing the ecological heart that feeds the civilization. This becomes especially important when the so-called Sea Peoples appear in the record. The term is imperfect, probably covering multiple groups and movements rather than one single united enemy, but the pressure they represent is real enough. Along with wider instability across the eastern Mediterranean, they become one of the most visible symbols of the age's dislocation. Egyptian inscriptions, especially under Ramesses III, present dramatic victories against these groups by land and sea. As always, royal inscriptions must be read critically. They exaggerate, stylize, and turn survival into total triumph. Yet beneath the boasting lies a significant truth. Egypt is under serious pressure, and unlike some other powers, it manages to repel enough of it to preserve the state. That preservation is not absolute. Even when Egypt survives the immediate crisis, its imperial reach contracts. Influence in parts of the Levant weakens. Resources tighten. The new kingdom order grows more brittle. Internal tensions deepen. Temple wealth, court politics, and military burdens all become harder to balance. Survival here does not mean unbroken dominance. It means that the core civilization remains intact while the outer shell of empire frays. This distinction is vital. Many ancient powers are strongest in appearance just before they fall, because they confuse imperial scale with durable foundations. Egypt, by contrast, can afford to lose some of its outer reach and still remain itself. That is one of the deepest structural advantages it possesses over more exposed or less internally coherent rivals. Climate may also play a role in this differential survival. There is growing evidence that parts of the wider eastern Mediterranean experienced drought stress during the collapse era. Reduced rainfall, harvest failure, and famine would have intensified migration warfare and political breakdown across already vulnerable systems. Egypt too shows signs of strain, and the evidence remains incomplete in important details. But its agricultural system is not based primarily on local rainfall in the same way as some of its northern neighbours. It depends on Nile inundation, which is influenced by climatic conditions elsewhere in Africa. That does not make Egypt safe from environmental trouble, but it does mean Egypt's food base is linked to a somewhat different ecological mechanism. In a period when drought may be devastating rain-fed regions, Egypt's river system may offer relative though never absolute insulation. There is also the matter of habit. By this point in its history, Egypt has already survived major internal fragmentation, foreign challenge, and political reinvention. It knows how to narrate crisis as a disturbance of order rather than the end of the world. That is not just ideology, it affects behavior. A civilization that has already reassembled itself once may prove less psychologically and institutionally brittle when confronted with new emergencies. What survives in the record suggests that Egypt, even under severe strain, still possesses strong administrative reflexes, deep sacred institutions, and a concentrated heartland capable of sustaining reduced forms of state life. It may be weakened, but it is not improvising civilization from scratch. This is where comparison becomes revealing. The Hittite Empire vanishes with startling completeness from the great power stage. Mycenaean palace culture collapses into a much more fragmented post-palatial world. Ugarit is destroyed and not rebuilt as the same kind of center. Egypt, meanwhile, loses standing, loses reach, and enters a more troubled age, but temples continue. Kingship continues, scribal culture continues, burial continues, and the Nile Valley remains politically meaningful as Egypt. That continuity is not glamorous compared with imperial triumph, yet in the long run it's far more important. The civilization has enough depth to survive contraction. A lesser-known clue to this resilience lies in labor and settlement. In some collapse zones, destruction layers suggest sharp breaks in habitation and administrative organization. In Egypt, the story is more uneven. There are serious problems, local dislocations, and evidence of corruption. Delayed rations and instability in places like Deir el-Medina, where even royal tomb workers experience disruption. These glimpses are valuable because they show that the strain is real, not just a distant geopolitical abstraction. Workers complain, supplies falter, authority can no longer always deliver what it once promised. But even here, the system does not simply vanish overnight. The very survival of complaint records tells its own story. Institutions are fraying yet still functioning enough to leave evidence of the strain. This is perhaps the most revealing truth about Egypt during the wider Late Bronze Age collapse. It survives not because it is undamaged, but because its damage remains survivable. Its state has layers. Empire can shrink. Dynasties can weaken. Foreign threats can wound prestige. Local disorder can spread. Yet beneath those losses, the civilization still retains a fed core, a sacred geography, a long administrative memory, and a culture that continues to imagine unity, even when unity is compromised. Other states under similar combined pressures cross the threshold into discontinuity. Egypt hovers near that threshold and pulls back. That does not make Egypt uniquely virtuous or uniquely advanced in any simple sense. Luck almost certainly plays a role. Timing matters. The exact sequence of shocks matters. The quality of individual rulers matters. Geography matters. But the pattern still demands explanation. When the Eastern Mediterranean system buckles, Egypt proves unusually capable of shedding external complexity while preserving internal continuity. It is less like a brittle tower and more like a heavy structure built low along the river, able to lose its upper ornament without immediately collapsing at the base. The cost, however, should not be softened. After this period, Egypt is no longer quite the same commanding power it had been. The old imperial confidence is harder to sustain. The civilization survives, but survival increasingly means persistence through diminished circumstances. That too is part of the answer to the larger mystery. Egypt lasts so long partly because it does not require every century to look like a golden age. It can endure being smaller than it was. It can endure being weaker than it was. It can endure the humiliation of living after splendor. So while other Bronze Age powers fall into a darkness from which their old forms never truly return, Egypt demonstrates a harsher, wiser endurance. It can remain a civilization even after ceasing to be the greatest power in its world. In ancient history, that may be one of the rarest strengths of all. What weakens great states is rarely a single blow. More often it is a pressure system building quietly across fields, storehouses, roads, and expectations until the old guarantees begin to fail all at once. Egypt faces that kind of pressure again and again, and one of the most revealing parts of its long survival is the way it responds to environmental stress. Climate trouble, poor inundation, famine, disrupted trade, and social strain are not side notes in Egyptian history. They are among the sharpest tests of whether the civilization's famous stability is real or merely ceremonial, and the answer, as usual, is not simple. Egypt suffers badly when nature and politics align against it. People go hungry, authority falters, texts remember fear with unusual bitterness. Yet Egypt also shows a repeated capacity to absorb ecological crisis without always becoming terminally unrecognizable. The dependence on the Nile lies at the center of this story. Egypt's greatest strength is also its great structural vulnerability. A civilization built around one river can flourish with extraordinary coherence when that river behaves within expected range. It can also be shaken across its entire length when the flood is too low, too irregular, or badly timed. Unlike societies with broader rain-fed hinterlands, Egypt cannot easily step outside the Nile system. Its agricultural heart is narrow, concentrated, and exposed to the river's moods. That means environmental shocks can become national shocks very quickly. Low inundation is not just a bad season. It can mean reduced harvests, rising prices, strained storage, local hoarding, weakened tax flows, unpaid workers, temple shortages, and political resentment spreading through the same corridor that normally carries abundance. Some of the clearest moments of Egyptian instability appear closely linked to such conditions. The end of the Old Kingdom, as already seen, may coincide with episodes of poor flood and wider aridity. Much later in the late New Kingdom, and after there are signs of food, stress, labor, unrest, and mounting insecurity. Scholars still debate the exact causal chains in each period, and the evidence remains incomplete, especially when trying to connect paleoclimatic records to particular historical events. What survives in the record suggests not that climate mechanically produces collapse, but that it acts as an amplifier. A strong state may endure several weak floods. A brittle state already divided by elite rivalry or burdened by military expense may find that the same environmental pressure exposes every hidden weakness at once. This is why adaptation matters so much. Egypt cannot control the river, but it can build habits around uncertainty. Storage is the first and most obvious defense. Granaries, tax collection, ration systems, and the redirection of surplus from stronger regions or stronger years are all part of the kingdom's attempt to turn environmental fluctuation into manageable risk. The existence of these systems does not prove they always worked fairly. They often favoured elites, temples, and the court. Corruption, local withholding, and uneven distribution must have been persistent dangers. Yet even imperfect storage makes a difference. A civilization that anticipates bad years stands a better chance of surviving them than one that assumes continuity until continuity fails. Measurement is another adaptation. Later nilometers, however imperfectly preserved in the record, symbolize a larger mentality, already visible much earlier. Egypt watches the flood. It records, compares forecasts as best it can, and ties political awareness to environmental signs. There is something strikingly modern in this impulse. The river is sacred, but it is also observed. Priests and officials do not merely pray for abundance, they seek to know how much is coming. That blend of reverence and monitoring may be one of the understated marks of Egyptian resilience. A society survives long-term stress not only by honoring nature, but by paying attention to it with disciplined seriousness. The adaptation is also social. During times of localized hardship, provincial elites and temple institutions can become fallback structures of support, at least in some cases. Tomb biographies and self-presentations from different periods sometimes boast that an official fed the hungry, protected the weak, or kept order during famine. These claims are certainly self-serving and should not be accepted uncritically. Elite inscriptions are not neutral reports, but even allowing for exaggeration, they suggest something important. Egypt's social architecture contains multiple levels of authority capable of buffering crisis. This can be dangerous for the crown because local power may grow at the centre's expense, but it also helps explain why environmental stress does not always turn into civilizational blankness. If one layer weakens, another may hold communities together just enough to preserve continuity. Trade disruption adds another dimension. Egypt's internal food base is powerful, but no long-lived civilization is truly self-contained. Metal supplies, timber luxury goods, military equipment, and diplomatic exchange all matter. When broader international networks fail, as in the late Bronze Age collapse or in later troubled eras, Egypt loses not only prestige but practical resources. Bronze depends on imported tin. Chariot warfare depends on broader systems of supply and maintenance. Monumental building often depends on secure transport and stable administration. Environmental trouble in Egypt therefore becomes even more dangerous when joined by external disruption. A weak flood can be endured more easily if trade still functions and political authority remains strong. The same weak flood becomes more dangerous when the wider world is unstable. Armies are expensive and local elites are less willing to yield resources upward. This is exactly why Egypt's long survival is so revealing. Again and again it faces not isolated crisis but converging crisis. Nature misbehaves, prices rise, workers complain, foreign pressure mounts, temple wealth grows harder to balance against royal needs, court politics turn corrosive, and yet the civilization often bends rather than snaps. The workmen's strikes at Deir el-Medina in the late New Kingdom are a famous example. Royal tomb workers protest delayed rations, an extraordinary sign of state strain. The details are concrete, almost painfully ordinary shortages, missed deliveries, frustration with officials who can no longer maintain the old flow of provisions. This is not grand collapse in a burning palace. It is something more intimate and more dangerous, the daily system no longer doing what it promised. And still, even here, the record exists because the world around it remains structured enough to document grievance rather than vanish into silence. A lesser-known strength may lie in Egyptian temporal thinking itself. A society built around cyclical flood, cyclical ritual, cyclical renewal may be better prepared psychologically for return after hardship than one whose political confidence depends too heavily on uninterrupted ascent. Egypt is capable of imagining bad years as terrible, even morally charged, without necessarily imagining them as final. That does not spare anyone from hunger. It does not make famine less brutal. But it may help explain why restoration remains such a persistent political possibility. The land has failed before and recovered before. The proper order has been broken before and repaired before. A civilization shaped by cycles may endure shocks differently from one shaped primarily by linear conquest or palace prestige. Still, adaptation has limits. Some crises leave scars that do not fully heal. Repeated low floods, especially when paired with political fragmentation, can hollow out trust in central authority. Long-term shifts in climate can alter settlement patterns, agricultural margins, and the sustainability of existing institutions. No single explanation fully accounts for why Egypt survives some environmental pressures and not others, or why certain periods produce recovery while others slide toward long decline. Luck matters, timing matters. So does the ability of rulers to keep extraction from becoming predation during hard years. A state that taxes too rigidly in bad conditions may destroy the very base it depends on. This is why Egypt's endurance should never be confused with invulnerability. The civilization is stable partly because it is adaptive, but adaptation is often painful, unequal, and politically dangerous. It may involve stronger local magnates, militarized frontiers, temple concentration of wealth, tighter management of labor, or new dependencies on foreign arrangements. Survival solves the immediate problem while often creating the conditions of a later one. That pattern runs through Egyptian history with quiet persistence. And yet the larger point remains. Egypt faces many of the same ecological and systemic dangers that ruin other ancient states. Flood failure, drought, links, famine, disrupted exchange, labor, unrest, and political strain all appear in its story. What makes Egypt remarkable is not that it escapes these dangers, but that it repeatedly converts crisis into contraction adjustment and eventual continuation rather than immediate oblivion. The Nile teaches abundance, but it also teaches risk. Egyptian civilization lasts so long because for centuries at a time it learns how to live with both. In the end, environmental stress strips away illusion. It reveals whether a state's stability is real enough to survive hunger. Again and again, Egypt answers that test imperfectly, sometimes brutally, sometimes only just. But it answers it often enough to remain one of history's longest-lived civilizations. That may be the clearest proof that its endurance is more than a monument-deep illusion. It is a practiced response to uncertainty. By this point, Egypt's survival no longer looks like simple stability. It looks like repetition with memory. Dynasties change, capitals shift, borders expand and contract, foreign customs enter military realities, harden, and whole centuries leave behind evidence of strain rather than confidence. Yet through all of this, something keeps pulling Egypt back toward itself. The temples continue to stand at the center of that force, but they are only part of it. Language, artistic convention, burial practice, sacred geography, and the careful conservation of old forms all work together to create one of the strongest cultural continuities in the ancient world. This is the weight of tradition, and it may be the most difficult Egyptian strength to measure, because it is not a wall, an army, or a harvest. It is a habit of civilization so deep that even change often has to disguise itself as continuity to be accepted. There is something unusual in the Egyptian relationship to the past. Most civilizations honor ancestors and remember founders, but Egypt develops a far more systematic attachment to earlier forms. The past is not merely admired, it is preserved, copied, reactivated, and made politically useful. Kings restore older monuments. Priests maintain rituals whose authority lies precisely in their age. Scribes copy classical texts and transmit formulas that may already have been ancient when they were recopied. Artistic styles remain recognizably Egyptian across astonishing spans of time, even while details shift from one period to another. Human bodies in relief are still shown according to conventions that would be legible centuries apart. Tombs still orient themselves within a moral world older than the dynasty that commissions them. Sacred language remains conservative long after spoken language evolves. This is not stagnation. It is continuity turned into strategy. The temples are central because they are among the greatest institutions of preserved memory ever created. A temple in Egypt is not only a place of worship, it is an archive, an estate, a workshop, a center of learning, a node of regional identity, and a machine for keeping the world familiar. Offerings continue according to inherited sequence. Priests learn and repeat older words. Gods remain attached to specific places with remarkable tenacity. Amun is not interchangeable with Ptah or Osiris simply because political power changes hands. Each deity is rooted in a local sacred landscape that anchors memory in stone festival procession and community habit. That rootedness matters. A civilization held together by many old holy places can survive the fall of particular regimes because legitimacy does not vanish with one palace. It remains distributed through the country. This sacred geography is one of Egypt's least dramatic but most durable strengths. The Nile Valley is not just politically unified in the ideal, it is ritually mapped. Memphis, Thebes, Abydos, Heliopolis, Elephantine, Saqqara, Karnak, Luxor, Philae, and countless other sites hold layers of sanctity that accumulate across generations. To move through Egypt is to move through a landscape already thick with remembered meaning. Rulers can exploit that, but they cannot easily replace it. Even conquerors who seize the throne find themselves dealing with places older than their own authority. This is why restoration of temples is so often one of the first acts of rulers seeking legitimacy. To repair a temple is to announce participation in time itself. Language strengthens the pattern. Egyptian writing changes over the centuries as all writing systems and languages do, yet there is a striking conservatism in formal and sacred usage. Classical forms remain prestigious long after everyday speech has moved on. Scribes are trained within traditions that preserve older models rather than constantly reinventing them. This creates a deep continuity of expression. A text copied in a later age may speak in the voice of a much earlier one, and that act of copying is itself a declaration that the old order still has authority. Scholars still debate how fully different levels of society participated in this literary conservatism, because literacy remained restricted, and elite culture does not stand in for everyone. But what survives in the record suggests that the institutions that mattered most for state temple and elite life were saturated in inherited forms. That gives the civilization a long memory of itself. Burial custom may be an even clearer example. Egypt changes its tomb styles repeatedly. Monumental pyramids give way to rock-cut tombs, hidden. Royal burials, different coffin traditions, changing funerary texts and new visual programs. Yet beneath these shifts lies an extraordinary continuity of purpose. The dead must be preserved, named, provisioned, protected, and morally situated. The body matters, the tomb matters, the afterlife is structured, proper ritual and inscription matter. The grave is not a disposal site. It is a continuation of identity under carefully maintained conditions. This consistent concern with preserving the self beyond death reinforces a culture already inclined toward formal continuity in life. A society that invests so heavily in maintaining the dead is likely to invest heavily in maintaining institutions, formulas, and places as well. There is a revealing paradox here. Tradition can make a society strong, but it can also make it heavy. The temple system, so powerful in maintaining continuity, can accumulate enormous wealth and become difficult for kings to control. Conservatism in sacred and artistic forms can discourage experiments that might have solved new problems more flexibly. Reverence for precedent can make reform politically risky. This tension is visible throughout Egyptian history. Sometimes it is productive, sometimes it becomes a burden. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases, but what survives suggests that tradition works best when supported by material abundance and confident rulers. Under stress, the same traditional weight can become a kind of institutional drag, and yet even that drag preserves something precious: recognizability. Egypt is not merely long-lived because people keep inhabiting the Nile Valley. It is long-lived because century after century they can still recognize a meaningful version of Egypt there. The gods are familiar. The sacred script of kingship is familiar. The visual order of temple walls is familiar. The burial logic is familiar. The old duality of Upper and Lower Egypt is still politically resonant. The black land and red land are still conceptually present. Even when outsiders rule, these old forms provide the grammar through which authority must speak. That is what makes tradition so powerful. It defines the terms of reality for so long that change is forced to enter by wearing its clothing. One lesser-known feature of this continuity is the deliberate archaism that appears in some later periods. Rulers and artists do not only inherit older styles unconsciously, at times they intentionally revive them. The Kushite pharaohs, for example, draw on earlier Egyptian models with marked seriousness. Later site rulers too will look backward with studied care. This is more than nostalgia, it is political archaeology. The past is mined for legitimacy, because it still works. A civilization capable of drawing authority from a past already thousands of years deep possesses a remarkable reservoir of symbolic power. This helps explain why Egypt can lose independence gradually without immediately losing identity. Foreign dynasties come and go. Military realities shift. Trade networks rise and fail. But the deeper cultural template holds long enough that even reduced Egypt remains unmistakably Egypt. The temples still process the gods. Priests still recite inherited words. The dead are still prepared through familiar moral logic. Art still places bodies and symbols inside a stable visual universe. Administrative language still carries old echoes. The civilization continues to tell the same broad story about order, death, kingship, and sacred land even as the political conditions surrounding that story grow steadily more unstable. No single explanation fully accounts for Egypt's longevity, and tradition alone cannot feed a kingdom or stop an invading army. But tradition changes the scale of what counts as survival. A state may be weakened, a dynasty may be foreign, a treasury may be strained. Yet if the temples still function, if the sacred geography still matters, if the cultural forms remain authoritative, then the civilization has not ended. It has endured in a reduced or altered condition. That distinction is essential to understanding Egypt. Many ancient powers vanish because once their state fails, not enough else remains to preserve identity at scale. In Egypt, identity is held by too many institutions, too many places, and too many repeated forms to disappear quickly. So the weight of tradition is not decorative. It is structural. It presses down through centuries, sometimes slowing adaptation, sometimes preserving life, often doing both at once. It turns old habits into national infrastructure. It makes the past available as a tool of recovery. It gives conquerors something they must imitate reformers, something they must respect, and ordinary continuity something to attach itself to when power becomes uncertain. Egypt lasts so long partly because its civilization becomes difficult even for a time to surprise. Too much has already been remembered. Too much has already been repeated. Too much of the old order still stands not only in stone but in the patterned expectations of how life, death, and rule are supposed to be arranged, and yet endurance has a threshold. A civilization can survive repeated shocks, survive the loss of empire, survive foreign rulers, survive reduced wealth and altered borders, and still move gradually toward a point where survival no longer means independence. This is the long late story of Egypt. It is not a dramatic fall in the style of a burned palace world vanishing almost overnight. It is slower, more layered, and in some ways sadder than that. Egypt remains alive for centuries after its greatest power fades, but increasingly it does so under rulers who are Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, Persian, Macedonian, or Roman. The temples still stand, the Nile still floods, the old symbols still carry force. Yet the political centre of gravity begins to shift outward, and once that process gathers pace, it becomes harder and harder for Egypt to govern itself on its own terms. The first stages of this long decline begin within Egypt rather than outside it. After the high, new kingdom royal authority weakens, and one of the most important signs of that weakening is the growing power of the priesthood, especially the great cult of Amun at Thebes. Temple wealth, land-holding and influence had long been part of Egypt's strength, but now they become increasingly difficult to balance against the crown. Kings still rule in name, but in practice, the country can begin to divide between different centres of authority with the north and south, moving under separate but overlapping structures. What survives in the record suggests a state whose sacred institutions are now so strong that they no longer simply support kingship, they can rival it. This is one of the ironies of Egyptian endurance. The very institutions that preserved continuity also helped make centralized sovereignty harder to maintain. Into that weakened landscape step Libyan elites first as military settlers and regional power brokers later as kings. Their rise is not an abrupt foreign conquest in the older imperial style. It is more gradual and more entangled with the Egyptian system. They settle, serve, gain power, and eventually take the throne through local networks already embedded in the country. This matters because it shows how much Egypt's political fabric has changed. A civilization once defined by overwhelming central unity now makes room for rulers whose authority emerges through fragmented regional dynamics. And yet even here the old pattern holds. Libyan dynasts rule as pharaohs. They take Egyptian royal names. They operate through Egyptian symbols. Egypt is weakened, but the grammar of power remains deeply Egyptian. Then come the Nubians, the Kushite kings from the south, and once again the story refuses to be simple. Their conquest of Egypt in the 8th century BCE is often treated as another sign of decline, but it is also one of the clearest demonstrations of Egypt's enduring cultural magnetism. The Kushite rulers do not merely seize Egypt, they embrace its oldest forms with remarkable seriousness, presenting themselves as restorers of proper pharaonic order. In art, religion, and royal ideology, they often look back deliberately to earlier Egyptian models. This is a striking moment. Even as Egypt loses political independence, its civilizational prestige remains so powerful that conquerors from outside the old heartland adopt and defend it with genuine commitment. Survival and subordination continue to exist together, but the wider Near Eastern world is changing too quickly for this restoration to last without challenge. Assyria enters the picture with a scale of military force Egypt has difficulty resisting. The Assyrian Empire is organized for conquest with ruthless efficiency, and its intervention in Egypt exposes how far the balance of power has shifted. Egypt is still rich, still symbolically immense, still worth fighting over, but it is no longer the kind of state that can dominate the great empires forming to its northeast. Native rulers can return after Assyrian pressure ebbs, and there is even a brief renaissance under the Sate dynasty, when Egypt regains a measure of stability and self-confidence. This is another reminder that Egyptian recovery is never impossible. The old land remains capable of reassembling itself, but the scale of the challenge is changing. Each restoration now takes place in a world more crowded with large aggressive powers. This Sate age is one of the most revealing late moments in Egyptian history. It shows both the resilience and the limits of the civilization. There is administrative competence, artistic revival, renewed attention to old forms, active engagement with Mediterranean trade, and an obvious attempt to strengthen the kingdom through adaptation. Greek mercenaries and foreign contacts become more prominent. Egypt is trying once again to survive by combining tradition with strategic flexibility. For a time it works, but the fact that it must rely so heavily on hired soldiers and external alignments is also telling. The older model of self-contained Nile-centered sovereignty is becoming harder to sustain. Adaptation keeps Egypt alive, but it also reveals dependency. Persian conquest brings that reality into sharper focus. Egypt resists rebels and periodically reasserts native control, but the pattern is now increasingly one of intermittent autonomy within a world dominated by larger imperial systems. The Persian Empire can absorb Egypt as one valuable province among many, and however uneasy the fit may be, the fact itself matters. Egypt is no longer simply one of the great powers, it is an object of competition between them. Scholars still debate the exact texture of Persian rule in different phases, and the evidence remains incomplete for many local experiences. But the broader truth is unmistakable. Egypt can still be difficult to govern, still rich in symbolic prestige, still capable of revolt. Yet it is no longer secure against incorporation into empires whose centre lies elsewhere. Then comes Alexander, and after him the Ptolemies, and the story becomes more complicated still. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt is ruled by Greek-speaking Macedonian elites, yet the old pharaonic forms continue in temple life with extraordinary persistence. Alexandria rises as a new capital of dazzling importance connected to Mediterranean intellectual and commercial worlds in ways earlier Egypt had never been. This creates one of the strangest dualities in Egyptian history. Politically, the centre has shifted into a Hellenistic monarchy tied to wider Mediterranean systems. Culturally and religiously, ancient Egyptian forms remain profoundly alive in the countryside and temple network. The civilization has not died. It has become layered. Old Egypt and New Egypt now exist together, not peacefully in every respect, but durably enough to last for centuries. This layering is both strength and warning. It shows that Egypt can endure astonishing change without immediate dissolution. But it also shows that endurance now takes the form of coexistence rather than sovereignty. The native language cults and sacred landscapes persist, yet the ruling class, the primary court culture, and much of the strategic horizon have moved elsewhere. Rome will intensify this condition. Once Egypt becomes a Roman province after the defeat of Cleopatra and Antony, its old political independence is effectively over. The Nile still matters enormously, perhaps more than ever, as a source of grain for the wider empire, but now it matters within another civilization's logic. There is a lesser-known sadness in this long transition. Egypt does not fall because it becomes empty or forgotten. It falls politically while still being dense with memory, ritual, and life. Temples continue operating. Priests continue serving old gods. Rural communities continue patterns older than the empires now ruling them. Ancient forms do not vanish in a single conquest. They keep breathing beneath successive layers of external control. That is why the loss of independence is so prolonged and so difficult to date neatly. when exactly as Egypt no longer Egypt, when the throne is foreign, that happens more than once, yet the civilization continues. When the language of state changes, that too is gradual. When temples close, that comes much later. The evidence refuses a simple ending. Still by this stage the deeper trend is clear. Egypt's old strengths, its concentrated geography, its sacred political grammar, its agricultural abundance, its administrative memory, its weight of tradition, can preserve identity longer than they can preserve sovereignty. The civilization remains itself more successfully than it remains free. That distinction matters because it marks the limit of endurance. A society can survive as a recognizable civilization inside larger imperial systems for a very long time. It cannot do so forever without becoming something changed beyond recovery. So the slow loss of independence is not a sudden defeat, but the drawn-out moment when endurance begins to separate from power. Egypt is still there. Egypt is still recognizable. Egypt is still sacred, productive, and symbolically formidable. But it is now increasingly governed inside frameworks set by others. The long-surviving civilization has not yet ended, but for the first time its future belongs less to pharaohs than to the empires that have learned how valuable the Nile will always be. That is where the question becomes most difficult and perhaps most interesting. What does it actually mean for a civilization to end Egypt forces that question, because almost every easy answer fails. If a civilization ends when its rulers are no longer native, then Egypt ends many times and somehow keeps going. If it ends when it is conquered, then Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, and Romans should each count as the finish, yet none of them quite manages to close the story. If it ends when its language changes, the answer comes late and unevenly. If it ends when the old religion disappears from public life, then the true ending lies centuries after the last pharaoh in any traditional sense. Egypt lasts so long not only because it survives, but because its survival stretches across categories that historians usually prefer to keep separate: state, culture, religion, language, memory, and land. For most of its history, these things reinforce one another. The king supports the temples sanctify the king. The language of rule echoes the language of ritual. The Nile Valley gives all of it a coherent stage, and the dead are folded into the same moral order that governs the living. But in the later centuries, these elements begin to separate. Political sovereignty slips away first, as already seen. The state becomes dynastic in foreign hands, then provincial within larger empires. Yet the old cults continue. Priests still perform rites in ancient sanctuaries. Hieroglyphic and demotic writing still exist in ritual and administrative use. Sacred geography still matters. The dead are still treated through inherited frameworks. In other words, Egypt as a civilization outlives Egypt as an independent state by an astonishing margin. Under the Ptolemies, this split becomes vivid. Greek-speaking rulers govern from Alexandria, a city that is in some ways deeply Egyptian by location and economic dependence, and in other ways radically new in its language, urban form, and cultural orientation. The court participates in Hellenistic politics, diplomacy, and intellectual life. Yet beyond the palace and the Greek civic sphere, ancient Egyptian religious life remains active and deeply rooted. Temples continue to be built and decorated in classical Egyptian style. Priests negotiate with rulers, preserve cult traditions, and maintain ritual continuity that reaches back into a past already ancient by Ptolemaic times. The civilization has not disappeared into Greek rule. It has become dual-layered and unevenly transformed. This layered survival continues into the Roman era. Rome does not need Egypt to be culturally uniform. It needs its grain taxes, strategic position, and administrative reliability. That allows a surprising degree of continuity in some older forms, at least for a time. Temples remain important. Egyptian priests continue to function. The local language persists in written forms. Village life along the Nile retains deep structures that would not have seemed entirely alien to much earlier Egyptians. Yet the surrounding world is shifting. Greek remains dominant in much administration and elite life. Roman power reorients Egypt toward imperial priorities. Urban and rural realities diverge. Identity becomes more complex. Egypt continues, but now inside a Mediterranean empire whose center lies elsewhere, and whose political imagination does not depend on pharaonic order. Even so, ancient Egyptian religion proves remarkably durable. This is one of the clearest signs that civilization can outlast sovereignty. The great temple complexes continue not merely as relics, but as living institutions. Offerings are made, festivals observed, cult images maintained, sacred texts copied. Fili Edfu, Dendera, Esna, and other sites preserve astonishingly late phases of Egyptian religious life. Some of the most elaborate temple inscriptions in classical Egyptian style belong not to the age of the pyramids, or even the New Kingdom, but to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. That fact alone should slow any easy story of decline. A civilization often becomes most conscious of preserving itself when the world around it is changing fastest. Egypt in these late temple centuries seems to know that memory has become a form of resistance. Language tells a similar story, though a more fragile one. Spoken Egyptian evolves over time into late forms that eventually feed into Coptic, written in an adapted Greek alphabet with additional signs. Hieroglyphic writing becomes increasingly restricted to sacred and monumental contexts, while demotic serves many more practical functions. This narrowing is significant. It suggests that the oldest formal language of the civilization is retreating into specialized use protected by priests and temple institutions, rather than shared broadly across public life. Scholars still debate how sharp some of these linguistic transitions felt to ordinary people, because written language and spoken life are never identical. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Egypt's deepest civilizational forms survive by becoming more concentrated. What was once the language of the whole sacred political world becomes over time the possession of shrinking institutions. Religion, then language, then memory, these are the final layers. And in late antiquity they begin to give way. Christianity spreads through Egypt with extraordinary force. At first, this does not erase the older religion overnight. The evidence remains incomplete in many local cases, and religious change is rarely clean. There are long periods of coexistence, conflict adaptation, and uneven transition. Some temples continue functioning for centuries after the Roman conquest. Some old rituals likely persist locally after official support wanes. But over time, the public world changes decisively. Christian institutions grow, imperial policy shifts, pagan cults lose legal and social ground, priestly transmission weakens, temples close or are repurposed. The old sacred geography remains physically present, but its living logic is breaking. There is perhaps no more haunting marker of this than the end of hieroglyphic writing. The last known hieroglyphic inscription at Philae in the 4th century CE is often treated as a symbolic full stop. It deserves that role with some caution. Civilizations do not end in single inscriptions. People continue living on the same land. Languages evolve rather than vanish cleanly. Older customs survive in transformed forms, yet this moment still matters. For more than 3 millennia, Egyptian civilization had expressed its sacred and royal imagination through that script. When the chain of priestly knowledge finally breaks, one of the deepest continuities in human history comes to an end. The signs remain carved on stone, but fewer and fewer people can still read them. A civilization that had always been able to talk to its own past begins to lose direct access to that conversation. And still even here the ending refuses to be simple. Coptic preserves the Egyptian language in new script and Christian context. Rural practices sacred associations with places' habits of land use, and inherited social patterns carry old echoes into new religious worlds. Egypt does not become empty of Egyptianness. It becomes something else built atop it. This is why the true ending of ancient Egypt is best understood not as annihilation, but as transformation beyond recovery. The old system of kingship temple religion, sacred writing and cosmic political order survives conquest after conquest, then finally fades when the institutions capable of reproducing it no longer function. The land remains, the people remain. But the ancient civilization in its old integrated form no longer does. A lesser-known irony deepens the story. Ancient Egypt ends so slowly that much of the later world forgets how to read it long before it forgets how to admire it. Obelisks are moved. Pyramids remain visible. Temples stand. Classical authors speculate. Medieval travelers wonder. But the internal language of the civilization is gone from view. Egypt becomes famous and mysterious at the same time. Its afterlife in memory begins as its living continuity finally weakens. In a sense, ancient Egypt becomes a lost civilization only after it has already lasted longer than almost any civilization has a right to last. So when does Egypt actually end? The most honest answer is that it ends in layers. It ends politically earlier than it ends culturally. It ends ritually later than it ends sovereignly. It ends linguistically later than it ends as a native state. It ends as a fully ancient system only when the last institutions capable of renewing that system disappear. No single explanation fully accounts for this drawn-out ending because the civilization itself had always been built from several kinds of continuity at once. That is why Egypt's longevity feels so unusual. It survives long enough that even its ending is prolonged into centuries. The civilization does not simply fall. It thins, persists, transforms, resists, and finally passes into history piece by piece. And in that long fading, perhaps more than in its greatest monuments, its true endurance becomes visible. In the end, the temptation is to look for one master key, one elegant answer, that explains why Egypt lasted so long, while so many other ancient civilizations burned brightly and fell apart. Geography is the obvious candidate, or the Nile, or religion, or bureaucracy, or luck. Each explains something real, and each fails if made to explain everything. Egypt endures because several strengths overlap and reinforce one another for an astonishing length of time. The river provides recurring fertility. The narrow valley provides coherence. Kingship binds political authority to cosmic order. Bureaucracy stores memory in practical form. Temples distribute legitimacy through a sacred landscape too old and too dense to vanish with one dynasty. Tradition gives change a language of restoration. Adaptation allows the civilization to borrow, absorb, and survive under pressures that might have erased something less deeply rooted. And yes, luck belongs in the list as well, because history always contains more contingency than monuments are willing to admit. The Nile is still where the explanation begins, because without the river there is no Egypt in the historical sense at all. But rivers alone do not create 3 millennia of recognizable continuity. Plenty of fertile landscapes produce states that fracture more completely. The Nile matters not simply because it feeds Egypt, but because it feeds a society arranged in a narrow corridor, where communication, sacred geography, and political integration become unusually reinforced by the land itself. Egypt does not have to invent unity out of scattered terrain. It grows inside a landscape that repeatedly suggests unity, even when unity has been politically broken. That is one reason collapse so often becomes reversible. The physical outline of the civilization remains visible to those living inside it. Food security matters just as much, though that phrase can sound calmer than the reality. Egypt is never secure in an absolute sense. A weak flood can become a national emergency. Famine and strain are woven into its history often enough to prove that abundance is fragile. Yet compared with many of its neighbours, Egypt possesses a stronger and more legible material base. Harvests can be counted, taxed, stored and moved along the river. Surplus can support temples, armies, scribal classes and public works. A civilization that can repeatedly turn food into institutions stands a better chance of surviving than one built on wealth that cannot be so steadily organized. Grain in the long run may have preserved Egypt as surely as any god, and yet food does not explain why the system remained meaningful. That belongs more to kingship and religion. The pharaoh is not simply an administrator standing above a productive countryside. He is in the Egyptian imagination the defender of right arrangement itself. Mahat gives political order a cosmic depth. This matters profoundly in times of fracture. If the state weakens, reunification can be imagined not as a new experiment, but as the repair of reality. That kind of legitimacy is stronger than force alone because it survives failed rulers. A bad king can be replaced without abandoning kingship. A broken kingdom can be restored without inventing a new moral language. Egypt's political theology makes return thinkable, and that makes endurance more likely. Then there is the bureaucracy, the least glamorous and perhaps the most underrated answer. Egypt lasts because it remembers how to function. Scribes, officials, granaries, estates, archives, offices and procedures keep the civilization from depending entirely on personal charisma or military conquest. What survives in the record suggests a society able to store operational knowledge across generations. Even when central power weakens enough, administrative memory often remains in local institutions, temple systems, and provincial structures to make reconstruction possible. Collapse in Egypt is often the failure of concentration rather than the total loss of knowledge. That is a crucial difference. A civilization that still knows how it is supposed to work is much harder to destroy. Tradition gives that administrative and sacred memory a deeper cultural shell. Egypt reveres its past with unusual seriousness and unusual utility. Older forms remain authoritative. Sacred texts are copied. Burial logic persists. Artistic conventions endure. Temples continue to embody inherited worlds of meaning. Rulers seeking legitimacy repeatedly restore, imitate, or revive what came before. This can create rigidity, and sometimes that rigidity becomes a burden. But it also gives Egypt a powerful reserve of recognizability. Other states may collapse so hard that the future no longer knows how to be the past. Egypt repeatedly knows. That knowledge, more than monumentality itself, is what makes the civilization feel continuous across such immense spans of time. Adaptation belongs in the answer too, because continuity alone is never enough. Egypt survives partly because it changes when necessary. It absorbs military techniques from abroad. It becomes more outward-looking after foreign shocks. It can function as a territorial kingdom, a regional empire, a culture under foreign dynasties, and finally, a civilization living inside larger imperial systems. That flexibility matters. If Egypt had been nothing but conservative, it would likely have broken much earlier. If it had been nothing but adaptive, it might have dissolved into other systems and ceased to feel like Egypt at all. Its long life depends on the balance between those two tendencies. Too much rigidity would have killed it. Too much fluidity would have erased it. What survives in the record suggests a civilization that repeatedly found for a time the narrow path between them. And then there is luck, which historians sometimes hide because it sounds unserious beside institutions and climate records. But luck is real. A different sequence of bad floods, a stronger foreign invasion at a weaker moment, a more complete regional systems collapse, a less capable dynasty. After major fragmentation, any of these might have shortened Egypt's story drastically. Geography helps, but geography is not destiny. Many of Egypt's strengths only matter because crisis does not always arrive in the most fatal possible combinations. To admit luck is not to diminish Egypt's achievement. It is to be honest about history. No civilization lasts that long without structural advantages. None lasts that long on structure alone. So the real secret of Egyptian longevity is not one cause but a rare alignment of causes that remain mutually reinforcing for centuries at a time. The river feeds the state. The state organizes the river's gift. Religion sanctifies the state. Tradition deepens religion. Bureaucracy preserves tradition in practical form. The landscape keeps the core coherent. Adaptation prevents the core from becoming too brittle. When one layer weakens, another sometimes holds. When empire is lost, the heartland remains. When kingship fractures, the sacred language of kingship remains. When sovereignty is lost, temple culture and social memory remain. Egypt survives because it is never only one thing. That perhaps is the final answer. The civilizations that fall fastest are often the ones built too heavily on a single foundation. One dynasty, one palace system, one military structure, one trade network, one moment of expansion. Egypt is different. It has many depths. It is a food system, a sacred geography, an administrative machine, a ritual order, a burial civilization, a political theology, a memory culture, and eventually a tradition so heavy that even conquerors must carry it. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but taken together they help explain why Egypt could lose wars, lose rulers, lose empire, and still remain Egypt for longer than almost any ancient people around it. Its greatest strength in the end may have been that it taught itself how to return. Not forever. Nothing human lasts forever. But long enough that age itself began to seem like one of its native powers. Word count 1174. The river's quieter now than the kingdoms it carried. Its flood no longer arrives as the old world knew it, and the rulers who once tied their names to its banks are dust beyond recall, except where stone and inscription still keep a little of their shape. But the strange thing about Egypt is that it never feels entirely past. Even after the dynasties are gone, even after the temples fall silent, even after the language of hieroglyphs passes out of living memory, the civilization lingers in the landscape as if time never fully persuaded it to leave. The valley still narrows between desert walls. Green still presses against red earth. Villages still gather where water allows life to persist. The old logic of survival remains visible even after the old gods and kings have gone. Perhaps that is why Egypt has always seemed larger than a sequence of dates. It is one of those rare human worlds where endurance itself becomes the mystery. Not how it conquered, though it did. Not what it built, though it built enormously. But how it remained recognizable for so long while so much else broke apart around it. The answer was never immortality. It was repetition, memory adaptation, and the stubborn concentration of life along a river that made return possible long after other worlds had forgotten how to come back from ruin. And in the end, even Egypt did not defeat time. Its temples closed, its sacred writing fell silent. Its political independence faded into the machinery of larger empires. Yet its passing was so slow, so layered, so reluctant, that it almost resembled another form of endurance. The civilization did not simply vanish. It dimmed by degrees, leaving traces everywhere in ruined pylons warming under late sun, in tomb walls where painted hands still offer bread to the dead, in broken statues staring past centuries of invasion, in fields that continue to green each year beside the same old water. That may be the last image worth keeping. Not the pyramids at noon hard and absolute against the sky, but the softer hour after, when light lengthens across the edge of the floodplain and the desert begins to cool. The stone is older than memory. The river keeps moving north. Reeds bend in the shallows. Somewhere in the darkening fields, life continues where it always had to continue, between abundance and drought, order and disorder, survival and loss. And for a span of time so long, it still unsettles the imagination that was enough to keep a civilization alive.